Slide 0. Forward. The power of will in international. Slide 1. Why listen to these words? Greetings. My name is Brigadier General Wayne Michael Hall. I'm the author of the book, The Power of Will in International Conflict. Today, I'm going to explain the book in a few visuals. I have confidence you will enjoy the book and find it useful. Following a thorough reading of this book, you will possess a well-armed mind ready to engage in and win in bouts of mental combat. Additionally, I see you discovering and a realization of the presence and nature of an overarching war of wits that any kind of conflict entails. My goal is to help you gain a thorough understanding of the phenomenon of will and to use this knowledge for advantage. Understanding and employing a deep knowledge about will is so important that it can mean whether or not you win or lose in a fight. After all, will is the central idea of conflict. When I say conflict, of course, I'm speaking of a broad range of struggles to win wars, to corporate takeovers, to competitive contests between lawyers in courts of law, to parents imposing their wills on their children, and even pertaining to spats between spouses. As a first gambit, I ask, what do you know about this great and important phenomenon? In my experience, I must confess that I have not explored this wonderful subject in sufficient depth until I researched and wrote my book. I found the book to be difficult to write because I didn't have much in the literature that related to what I sought to write about. As I finished writing this book, I can tell you that it punches straight into the subject of will. As a result, the book provides understandable and usable knowledge about this great phenomenon that has lived such a long life and influenced so many people in peace and war. As I thought, and then thought some more, will's meaning became clear. As such, in this book, I present a framework for thinking about the subject to gain clarity of its latent power and how people can apply this power to win in bouts of will. This book took well over 2 years to research and write. I had to cut the book from whole cloth as I could not find existing patterns to use as a guide for completing my intellectual journey. Of interest, as I wrote the book, I determined that I could have used this book throughout my entire 30 years of service in the United States Army and in my 17 years of work thereafter. With the hours I devoted to writing this book, I can say without equivocation that will, as a concept, still remains largely unknown today. For certain, people mention will, but usually only as platitudes and generalities if they mention it at all. But one tends to pass off sustained and deep thinking about will, thinking it to be too complicated to study, let alone to discuss. This book provides readers with showers of discoveries about will's meaning, its intellectual underpinnings, and how to turn theory of will into practice. In my view, a wide variety of people need to study and know the subject of will. This book should enable their knowledge to acquire a breadth and depth of thought sufficient to impose their will on an adversary successfully. In addition, this knowledge and comprehension that comes with reading the book must be sufficient to enable people, players in the game, as it were, to anticipate an opponent's resistance and counter moves. Further, studying this book will provide you with the intellectual wherewithal to overcome any attempts to deny you victory as you impose your will on an adversary and deftly deny the efforts to impose their will on you. In fact, you will surmise the worthiness of the book as you conclude that its concepts, ideas, thought models, definitions, and journeys from theory to practice provide the basis to win. Also, this book provides the wherewithal to gain an understanding, indeed comprehension, of the subject of will. A thorough reading provides you the wherewithal to use what you now know to outthink your adversary. It also provides you the intellectual means to possess and impose 7 kinds of advantage on an opponent. The book even provides sufficient depth of thinking and thought models to impose your will on an adversary at the inception of his first thoughts about the probability of attempting to impose his will on you. What proof do you have of your claim, I hear someone ask. I respond, as a starting point, there is no definition for will relative to conflict except for mine. I found no explanation of how to think about the thinking one has to perform to think about will. This is metacognition. My book satisfies this task. There is no system of thought to help people learn how to think about the intricacies of this phenomenon. I provide such a system. It is my book. I found no author who has explored this topic, defined the term, developed the concepts, and put forth the argumentation and explanation to understand this great phenomenon. My book resolves these shortfalls and inconsistencies. Of interest, I developed my own definition of will because none exists in doctrine. Of note, my definition identifies and discusses will as a struggle in the moral and physical domains. It involves a connected conflict with a distinct linkage among the past, present, and future, and postulates will's primacy and determinants for winning and losing in conflict. I present this definition for your consideration in slide 3. With this setting, know that throughout the book, I provide the reader with the wherewithal to put will to work in practical application. Thus, in this explanatory session of will, know well that the basis of my work lies in philosophy, history, theory, conceptualization, and creative thinking. Know, too, that I view the book as but a start. Will is a great subject and powerful phenomenon deserving of continuous study, publication, and actual use for seeking and securing advantages. This subject deserves to be studied in all of America's Department of Defense's Command and General Staff Colleges, schools of advanced military studies, and all war colleges. The substance of this book needs to be in America's Library of Doctrine and come live with explorations from now to infinity, particularly in intelligence, planning, operations, and decision-making doctrine. My desire is that many a thinking person start with my work and broaden and deepen it. This talk about my book is in reality a Cliff's Note walkthrough of the main ideas in the book. The book provides an explanation of its many ideas, themes, concepts, thought models, and how the reader can turn theory into practice in their everyday lives. To gain in knowledge and thinking, readers will have to commit to taking the time and expending the mental energy to comprehend this book. Lastly, know that the talk that accompanies the visuals is in my voice, with my thoughts, and with the passages coming from my mind. Slide 2, Intellectual Foundation of the Power of Will in International Conflict. The next few slides provide will's definition and discusses my use of great thinkers and captains in their many books, poems, and plays. I found joy in reading and rereading their works and using their passages. From my researching efforts, I became even more certain of the importance of my task to bring the great phenomenon of will into the light of day for direct examination. Slide 3, my definition of will. As I just noted, until now, there has been no definition of will that deals with conflict and imposing one's will on another person or denying an adversary's attempts to impose his will on you. But about the time my book was published, RAND researchers developed their own definition of will in one of their research projects. I read it, thought about it, and while good for their purposes, I quickly determined it was not sufficient for my purposes. I knew that I must have a good working definition to start the deep think effort to know will in depth. I felt the need to explain my thinking about this great phenomenon, will, with a sound basis coming from history, philosophy, theory, and creative thinking. With such a foundation, I could think about will and generate the theory and thought models to help people understand this difficult subject and to put its theory and concepts into actual practice. I needed a working definition so as to shape my thinking about the thinking of the central idea of all conflict, which is the concept of will. I went to work on defining will in my 2009 book, Intelligence Analysis: How to Think in Complex Environments, but it was only a start and a poor one at that. I wrote that book from 2006 to 2008. It was published in December 2009. I improved the definition and explanation of will in my next book, Intelligence Collection: How to Plan and Execute Intelligence Collection in Complex Environments. I wrote that book from 2009 to 2011. It was published in July 2012. Over time, I kept improving on the definition and its explanation. I evolved in my thinking by listening to criticisms and suggestions from my students. Nobody had a worthy definition, but the ideas that rolled around in those seminar rooms helped me form what you see now. On this graphic, you see a shorthand definition. This book has a more detailed definition, which expands upon this definition you see below. This shorthand definition presents the essence of will. It provides sufficient thought to enable the reader to understand what will means. The definition provides sufficient suggestion and implied direction to learn how to think about the concept. Understand, too, if a person understands the definition, one can envision the thinking underpinning the concept to broaden our views of will and set the conditions to coalesce its many parts and pieces into a whole, that is, the whole of will. With the whole and its parts, one gains an understanding of the entire concept. The shorthand definition of will is appearance of desire, volition, life force, bringing to life a purpose, to impose will on another entity who may or may not resist. With this appearance, a call goes forth in each side's collective minds for a willingness to sacrifice and an arousal of sufficient passion to win. This definition of will and its explanation one finds in The Power of Will in International Conflict must go into doctrine now. Each side must assess sufficiency of the moral and physical domains to impose their will or to deny or resist their adversaries' imposition efforts. People can readily assess the physical domain, which generally involves capabilities, but they run into trouble once they try to assess the moral domain, for it is unquantifiable. Thus, the book sculpts the moral domain for any participant in a conflict. As such, early in the presentation, the book suggests the need to surmise the importance of resolve, life force, strength of motive, purpose, determination, perseverance, sacrifice, passion, advantage, and disadvantage. In any conflict, these elements appear, but come and go in appearance, influence, and importance. Sometimes all are at play, but at other times and other contexts, some neither appear nor influence at all. Thus, players in a conflict must wargame clashes of will. What is different about this book is that along with traditional intelligence wargaming, people must now wargame the wargaming of their opponent. But know well, the outcomes of the moral domain can never be certain because what they deal with is the unquantifiable. It exists in a turbulent operational context, and its inhabitants, people, live in a wide variety of highly influential cultures. As one topic of wargaming, we focus on the adversary's willingness to sacrifice and arouse sufficient passion to endure hardships and win. This is a place that the appearance and the influence of both logic and bias errors often erupt, as you wargame from your perspective and as you wargame the adversary's wargaming. You find in this book an explanation of the importance of these subjects in the 14-element thought model for thinking about will. I discuss all 14 elements within the chapters in the book. Slide 4, talking with the masters and using their ideas. While researching for this book, I plumbed the thinking of authors in 81 books. The books ranged from literature, poetry, to books on science, philosophy, and history. I spoke with the masters in my quest to understand will. While none of them explicitly dealt with the idea of will that I sought, I borrowed ideas where I could. In some cases, I found their thinking useful, even as I acknowledged that they expressed their thoughts long ago. Their wisdom written so long ago helped me fill the gaps that I needed for my exploration into will. Each of these great authors gave me peeks into the shrouds encasing their actions. With their actions and outcomes therein, several of the great captains helped me surmise what they might have thought, but I don't know for sure. Most of their writings explained the action and its effect, but they did not explicitly explain their thinking about will and their opponent's will. I was looking for their thinking about how to impose their will on their adversaries and how they anticipated what their adversary might think about imposing his will on them. So I depended on their works pertaining to will that they dropped into their works. I examined their ideas from all sides to help me think about this complicated subject. The 5 thought venues coming closest to what I sought came from Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz in December of 1805, Scipio Africanus's victory of Illapa in 206 BC, as told by Scullard, certainly assisted my efforts. I also borrowed ideas from T.E. Lawrence and his masterpiece 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Caesar's commentaries, particularly his amazing rendition of the Battle of Lycia in 52 BC, and Clausewitz's On War. I also found Sun Tzu's theory and reasoning about war to be of use in my exploration of will. Literature also proved helpful in exploring the idea of will. In particular, I borrowed from the ideas of political theorists Hannah Arendt, authors Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, philosophers Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Pirsig. These authors helped me form the basis of my thinking. Additionally, Goethe's Faust and the dangers in unresolved quest for knowledge and Kant's thinking about man's self-serving nature proffered ideas to my mind, thus helping me understand why self-interest dominates any attempt to rationalize why people fight over will. Such struggles between competing, resisting entities exist today, and I dare say forevermore. Self-interest, clothed and cloaked as altruism, still lives. Thus, struggles for dominance of will have a permanence in human history. Slide 5, select discussion of the book's big ideas. As a summary, the book yields many ideas, big ideas. The details of these big ideas will continue to be resting in awaiting readers between the covers of my Book of Will. By big ideas, I am talking about ideas that grab the reader's mind and proceed to expose it to the main ideas in the book. I want these big ideas to stay with you as you read the book, and I hope forevermore. These ideas connect to other ideas not yet coming forth. The suggestion the reader draws is how these ideas, one by one, and then in aggregation, connect to other ideas and concepts the book introduces and explains. A big idea is a part of a larger whole, and it is the whole that is important. The reader needs identification and elucidation of these big ideas to envision, explain, and sense the whole under our examination. Also, these big ideas identify thoughts about functioning of the whole, and with it, how coherence contributes to how the whole can reappear on call in readers' minds. As another explanatory thought, a big idea presents implications and inferences. An implication in the vernacular is something that has not happened, but it is something you believe or sense to be coming. An inference is the works one's mind performs as data comes into their bodily portals and their minds render data into meaning. The data, by way of images, vision, or appearance, is coming, so your intuition warns you. It is that which is coming that your senses alert your mind to. This intuition presents to you as a reader of yearning to explore the sensing further. The urge comes to life in your mind before being either identified or discussed. Implications start taking shape as these thoughts take us into a higher level of thinking as a ladder extending to the heavens of knowledge. This is where minds draw inferences of meaning and relativity. Such thinking requires a high level of thinking, such as synthesis, holism, and metacognition. The requirement on the human mind comes down to the demand for deeper thinking than is required to deal with smaller and easier to understand ideas. Again, deep think means taking the time and expending the mental energy to think about a problem or issue critically and deeply. Big ideas urge the reader to admit to one's own need to study and learn more, agree or disagree, and reason as to why, see connecting ideas, and discover ways to investigate the many mysteries that remain even after finishing this book. From such thinking, one always comes forth with 8 additional ideas. 1. Coming forth with more creative thoughts about improving the book's central ideas. 2. Developing more thought models. 3. Finding other supportive ideas in a variety of intellectual areas of concentration. 4. Finding and plumbing the minds of other great thinkers. 5. Tinkering with the definitions that I have provided to you in the book. 6. Developing more concepts. 7. Designing ways to put the theory into practice. 8. Developing more and better implications. Conflict, how to think critically in complex environments. This forward is atypical of other. Slide 7, essence of the problem. I simplified this graphic to help people grasp what will and conflict means. Here I present the nub of will. Here, in the interest of time, I constrain my explanation of will's breadth and depth that a reader finds in my book. As you can see, one side attempts to impose their will on the other side. The other side could acquiesce if he determines the calculus of will, particularly capabilities, purpose, strength of motive, passion, and sacrifice, and determines if these elements of will are or are not in his favor. But in this case, the receiver of the first blow, an aggressive imposition, decides to resist, and we have a struggle over superiority of will. Observers of this graphic tend to concentrate on the clashes of wills. The wise person, though, views the slide holistically and bores into the right and left sides, looks carefully, and is drawn to the identical 4 words on each side. The words are desire, volition, life force, and resolve. They constitute, in my thinking, the inception of will, its birth, as it were. Remember these words as the inception of will. If you can anticipate these words and their strength and influence, you might want to impose some kind of preemptive action. Your intent would be to attack or influence the adversary's inception of will and plan at its genesis how to thwart this fellow's intent. We'll discuss these key words in more depth later in the briefing. But for now, keep in mind desire, volition, life force, and resolve. Since the beginning of time, men have competed with each other to obtain what one side wanted that the other side had and didn't want to part with. This is the genesis of the drive to impose will or deny such imposition. Action becomes the active force in that it is one or more actions that one side uses to impose his will on the other and how the other side resists this initial imposition. At the start, my imagination takes me to the dankness of a cave, where one caveman covets a fur, a woman, something that another man possesses. The coveter's desires, volition, life force, and resolve are at play, but he should also consider the mind of the coveted. If the coveter decides to move from a passive volition to an active imposition of will on the coveted, he attaches these invisible motivational thoughts to purpose, strength of motive, capabilities, and so on, and acts to impose his will on his opponent. If the coveted in this imposition resists, the two struggle. One side wins and the other side loses. Nonetheless, nothing in life is ever so simple as what you see here in this graphic. The clash of wills is much more complicated. You're going to delve into the complications now. The forward. Slide 8, collision of wills. In this visual, you see two wills clashing. It is definitely a collision, even in the cyber and information domains. You notice the presence of clashing objectives. You notice the presence of clashing assessments and adaptation. People have to think about these struggles as they occur first in the intersection of 7 vertical domain silos: air, ground, sea, space, cyber, information, and cognition. They intersect with 4 horizontal levels of conflict troughs: strategic policy, strategic military, operational, and tactical. Please note that I plan to discuss these concepts in the Matrix War discussion coming up later in the session. I need you to remember now, though, all the pieces matter in phrase over will. This is a truism that always serves one well while thinking about difficult problem sets in will. Notice the recursion occurring with all-important feedback loops for each competing organism. This is rudimentary for complex adaptive systems as they compete and assess their actions and try to adapt faster and better than their adversary. Yet another clash thematic. But put your mind to rest. But it cannot rest. You feel the need, in a broad and illustrative sense, to think again about the objectives for each side in the struggle, as blue considers theirs and red's objectives and vice versa. I also want you to think deeply, view, and comprehend the operational context. Examine its advantages and disadvantages for each player in the game of chance you have entered. The game has an outcome that isn't preordained. That is, it is the struggle for dominance of one's will over another person, organization, or country and their will. Are we done? No. We have to consider the dark cloud in the middle. It represents the moral domain of conflict. The moral domain is as important, or in some cases more important, than its counterpart, the physical domain of conflict. It is full of important aspects of conflict like the moral perspective, view of the context, potential for chance to occur, change, moving truths, involved and influential populaces, nonlinearity and its many irksome characteristics, and culture as it influences complex adaptive systems and their rules and action models. The fog of war is always at play, full of variables, some of which are sensitive. Thus, to grab the macro, I want you to engage in synthesis and holistic thinking. Each entwines with the other to create a powerful whole. Neither proves easy to understand or to apply in practice. Slide 9, Will's 14-element model. This is the hallmark thought model in the book. It has 14 elements. Any adversary will have some or all elements at play in conflicts of will. Please note that the front end, which includes elements life force and purpose, remains stable. These elements prove to be constant functions of will. The middle of the model, however, changes. Its elements, strength of motive, capabilities, advantage, disadvantage, perseverance, determination, passion, and sacrifice, prove subject to flux, coming with the play of sensitive variables on emotions and feelings. Additionally, while vying for ascendancy of wills in complex environments, one knows that at least several of many nonlinear systems' characteristics will be at play, coming and going, appearing, disappearing, growing powerful and becoming weak, being influential, and becoming negligible. The back end of the model, including imposition, action, assessment, and adaptation, also remain relatively stable as functions of will. The 14 elements involve the most important aspects of will. It took a good deal of time to dissect will and to find its key elements. As you can see, I envision 14 elements. In my judgment, not all elements play all the time. Thus, I had to consider that some elements cannot be quantified and some are not stable. In my view, these 14 elements or facsimiles thereof constitute, or better said, represent what any thinking foe uses. But again, some elements will come and go, or some do not appear at all or appear all the time. I do not know how to cut out any of the elements that you see here, but certainly agree that one could add more. As I intimated above, I did add degrees of flux in the middle elements as their power, roles, and influences depend upon variables, the thinking of human beings, outcomes of action, friction, and the turbulence and change involved with chaos. To top it off, each of the middle elements are intangible, lacking in finite shapes and forms. Thus they prove difficult, even abstract, to imagine and to bring forth as an appearance in our minds. Yet we know that they are at play, and any attempt to deal with will cannot ignore these elements without accepting risk and peril. Element fluctuation can also come with changing intensity and importance. Indeed, in conflict, truth changes. Thus, fluctuation comes forth and causes intensity to vary and importance to come and go. Sometimes some elements do not come into play because of weakness or pressures or abject irrelevance. Importance and change in the middle revolve around clashing missions, nonlinearity, the play of sensitive variables, and of course chance, and the ever unpredictable adversary. Also, note this is a model that encompasses the ideas in the book about the importance of complex adaptive systems, humans, and human-populated organizations, and their absolute need to co-evolve and adapt better and faster than their adversary. The model shows the importance of omnipresent feedback involved with the assessment and adaptation inherent with any complex adaptive system, or, as we call in this work, CAS. Slide 10, Riding the Wild Pendulum. This visual depicts two adversaries fighting one another over imposing will. The visual depicts nonlinearity, where permanence is changed, where time is timeless, where chaos reigns owing to the effects of nonlinear contexts surrounding and shaping each opponent's thinking and action. Our theoretical pendulum swings, indeed gyrates, as it travels first to blue, then to red. Our thinker's purpose is to ride the pendulum and drop off on the adversary's side, get into his mind, learn how he thinks and plans, learn his aim, goals, objectives, and strategies. Discover his will by using the 14-element thought model we just talked about in this briefing. Search for and discover what you believe to be his version of our model of will. Determine the power and energy of each element of the two wargaming models. Determine which of the elements have the greatest probability to appear and influence his thoughts and actions. Determine which of the elements have the greatest probability of remaining dormant, but capable of coming forth with changes in the situation and context. Determine which of the thought model elements, if any, won't be at play regardless of what transpires in the conflict. Determine the adversary's actions and how he could be planning to impose his will on us. Determine how he plans to assess outcomes of his actions. Determine how he thinks we think about our assessment of our actions. Determine how he thinks we think about assessing our outcomes. Determine how he evaluates assessment data, how he learns, and how he adapts. Search for and discover that which makes actions tangible and intangible and what makes them this way. Discern preeminence in his model, for example, strength of motive, passion, sacrifice, and so forth, and pack away into your mind. Think about how the adversary views the operational context. Consider the advantages it presents to him as well as the disadvantages. Consider the advantages and disadvantages the context presents to us. Consider how the adversary thinks the context presents advantages and disadvantages to him. Consider if the adversary has or will be thinking how we think the context presents advantages and disadvantages to us and to the adversary. Also, we have to think about how he thinks, we think, he thinks concerning advantages and disadvantages, but holding tight to the standard of always thinking and feeling from his perspective. When you have found some of what you want, you hang back on the pendulum and swing to the friendly side's processes of conclusion, recommendation, wargaming, and decision-making. Think hard about how your decision-maker's thoughts relate to your adversary's mind that you just visited. Continue to ride the pendulum until you have visited him enough to warrant suspension. Pick what you want to wargame. Think as an analyst from a friendly perspective and also wargame the adversary's wargaming. Adjust, consider his errors in thinking and yours and how he intends to protect his penchant to err. Think about how he intends to attack your errors. Anticipate how he thinks you are protecting against manipulation via his well-thought-about deception, changes, inputs from intelligence, realization of duality, views of context, thinking through observer relationships, and so forth. Take the time and expend a mental effort to think about wargaming your adversary's efforts to wargame. This is difficult. You have to be in his skin and think like he thinks and know how his culture and experience influences his rules, morals, and values. Know how the cultural-driven rules shape and drive his models of action. Then ride the pendulum again and jump off into the middle, and strive to think objectively, knowing full well that it is impossible to be objective. Employ a red team to examine your assumptions in this process. One of the assumptions will be identifying areas of his thinking in which he will be making logic and bias errors. Such work takes knowing and understanding how your adversary perceives, thinks, plans, decides, acts, assesses, uses observables to drive assessment collections, collects data, turns data into information, turns information into knowledge, evaluates outcomes, learns, and adapts. Identify areas of your thought in which you are prone to make logic and bias errors. Have a red team of an iconoclast attack your thoughts and plans and assumptions. Think about his views against your views, his intentions against your intentions, his advantages and disadvantages from the context. Think about your thinking against his thinking, your logic and bias errors against his mental and bias errors. Be as neutral as possible about what you have learned about the thinking of each side. Decide how to arrange his mind and how he intends to arrange your mind. Game on? Outcome is undeterminable. Be self-critical so as to uncover logic and bias errors. Slide 11. Wargame the adversary's wargaming. One could ask, why should I endure this most daunting mental task of wargaming your adversary's wargaming? It is a good question and worthy of a detailed response. Please allow me to explain. First, we can safely assume all human beings perform some kind of wargaming as they contemplate, prepare for action, and execute actions relating to will. We must acknowledge that worthy adversaries will attempt to anticipate what their adversary would not, or could not do in clashes of will. Second, we wargame our adversary's wargaming to attain one, two, or all 7 advantages over our opponent. These 7 advantages include initiative, tempo, momentum, knowledge, decision, position, and freedom of movement. The adversary will attempt to block our efforts to create advantages while strengthening his own attempts to seize and control these advantages. Third, mental combat demands that we outthink the adversary. This demand is at least partially met by wargaming the adversary's wargaming. So let's unpack this notion to gain a better understanding of the intricacies of this phenomenon. Wargaming the adversary's wargaming allows us to peer into our opponent's thought processes. This kind of wargaming enables us to think like our opponent thinks that we think, and to use this knowledge to our advantage. Such wargaming allows us to use our minds and machines to anticipate our opponent's actions. It allows us to anticipate his condition setting. This involves the necessary preparatory steps that he must accomplish for his actions to succeed. It allows us to search for and discover such condition setting and to juxtapose growing, spreading, and clutching vine-like links that connect the causes for his actions to his desired effects. Wargaming the adversary's wargaming allows us to present our decision maker with the opportunity to preempt the adversary's actions. Preemption allows our size to seize the always prized mental, emotional, or physical edge inherent to seizing and holding the initiative. Now, back to a broader explanation of this kind of wargaming. Know well that to outthink an adversary, we have to understand his aims, goals, objectives, and fathom how he plans to achieve these essentials in conflict. To outthink our adversaries, we have to have a good idea about how he confronts context in which conflicts occurs. He must resolve contextual impediments to his desired outcomes. Resolution must involve the essential building blocks one finds in one or more problem sets that he uses to drive his strategies and tactics. A problem set is a difficult problem that has numerous subproblems that relate to the whole problem at hand. It follows that we have to think how he thinks as he wargames. We must use this knowledge to beat him and win in clashes of will. I believe that his goals must involve achieving optimal performance of his setup actions. He must visualize, seek, and grasp the best opportunity and probability out of many to satisfy his purpose. From purpose and strength of motive, he eventually acts and thereby uses his capabilities to accomplish his aims, goals, missions, and objectives. Thus, I peer into the depth of my enemy's mind and stealthily enter this brain. There I find glimpses of his logic, experiences, cultural influences, views of the world, education, views of technology, influence of his coteries, which help him think and plan. This capability is so important that I submit learning how he thinks could be the most important outcome of wargaming the adversary's wargaming. Continuing, it seems logical to me that he must wargame his options against us. His overall purpose is to learn how to satisfy his intent to learn about, anticipate possible outcomes emanating from his adversary's act, react, and counteract actions. So, could he be wargaming or wargaming? The answer has to be yes, given that he is smart. In his wargaming, he will play out the conflict in a realistic operational context. This context is full of potential, but it always appears from his perspective against his hypothetical adversary. He might use artificial intelligence, perhaps even very smart, culturally programmed avatars, to oppose us in his wargaming. Also, he will employ a sophisticated human opponent to play his enemy in his wargaming. As such, he will play out the actions involved with accomplishing his aim, goals, objectives, and so on, as he imagines the two forces colliding. As we enter his mind, we must learn what he thinks about relative to himself and how he thinks we think about a minimum of 9 points. 1. What truly matters. 2. The value objectives. 3. Clausewitz's marvelous trinity. 4. The 14-element will model forming the central idea of this book. 5. The notion of multiple pressure points. 6. The notion of fewer and more important decision points. The notion of even rarer centers of gravity. 8. His how to think model. And 9. How he thinks you think that he thinks about these things. As another interesting twist, we must think about how our adversary thinks about battles. That is to say, in a broad sense, you must think as he thinks about a range of seemingly disparate battles appearing in our minds as competing wills, the clashes of each of the 14 critical elements, physical combat, mental combat, and the constant war of wits he sees himself fighting. All of us must realize that these seemingly disparate elements of conflict connect to one another and infold into a unified and connected whole. More specifically, this demanding kind of thinking about his thinking about battles is an important twist in wargaming his wargaming. Now let's delve into more specificity about battles. I'm speaking of the appearance and influence of 12 subsets of primary battles, including battles of narratives, battles of advantages and disadvantages, battles to outthink an adversary, battles involved in manipulating observed-observer relationships, engaging in battles of intelligence systems, battles of countering the adversary's assessment and adaptation protective methods and techniques, battles of clashing objectives, battles of respondent elements of quality, and the struggle to keep quality high against the adversary's efforts to pummel that which comprises criteria for judging quality, battles of minds, battles of life force and resolve, battles of sacrifice, and battles of passion. To wargame his wargaming, you need a realistic process that he would likely use as he wargames against you and your organization. In such a process, you must find a person well versed in the adversary's culture and thinking to play the adversary. One must always provide this person with enough resources so as to have the wherewithal to design his plan and play it out in the wargame. This person and his supportive elements must design a plan to win against you while he is thinking like you, the adversary, thinks. This list can add many more elements, as I'm giving you just a few examples. This person, whom I hope comes from the culture of your adversary, has few scruples, restrictions via rules of engagement, or moral inhibitions. This person is smart, ruthless, capable, full of hatred, and dedicated to win or die. This person or people will use a sequence of aim, goals, objectives, resources, constraints, strategies, tactics, the 14 element thought model of will, pressure points, decisive points, centers of gravity, and advantages and disadvantages the nonlinear operational context presents. This sequence also involves addressing the specter of logic and bias errors, assessing the quality of advice from experts in the adversary leader's inner coterie, visualizing the 13 element thought model that an actual adversary has to use as he plans, which includes 1. Perceive, 2. Think, 3. Plan, 4. Decide, 5. Act, 6. Assess, 7. Design observables, 8. Collect assessment data, 9. Recompose data into information, 10. Synthesize information into knowledge, 11. Evaluate, 12. Learn, and 13. Adapt. Now, let's review a few fundamentals your adversary would probably be using by way of talking with his mind as he thinks. I think a series of cautions could be guiding his thoughts, such as these admonitions. Determine the feasibility of my actions before they happen. Know that my adversary will assess strengths and weaknesses from competing perspectives. He anticipates how I ride the wild pendulum between opposing sides and find a middle point in which I can see these strengths and weaknesses from the viewpoint of each side and adapt to win. Assess the nonlinear operational context and judge my advantages and disadvantages relative to my foe's advantages and disadvantages in this turbulent context. Identify nonlinear context characteristics of the context. In my book, I present 17 characteristics that you can choose from. Judge the impact of nonlinear activities and their sudden appearance and subsequent influence on my operations as well as my adversaries. Again, the adversary knows he must assess the effectiveness of his intelligence system. As such, he muses about some of what follows. How well does this system provide essential data from my actions and those of my adversary? My goal must be to win in adapting faster and more effectively than my adversary. He will do the same for his adversary as he judges the quality of his intelligence and how he thinks about his adversary's efforts to assess, adapt, and co-evolve. Wargame my will against my adversary's will. Address some or all of the 14 elements that I tee up as critical elements in will. Note, do not forget the moral domains, such as respecting and understanding passion, sacrifice, determination, and perseverance. Continuing with an adversary's thinking, I must assess the feasibility of my actions necessary to impose my commander's will on our adversary. I must assess my foe's aim, goals, objectives, resources, constraints, strategies, tactics, will, pressure points, decisive points, centers of gravity, observer relationships, and so on. I can use a model to assess the battle of intelligence systems and counterintelligence and design counters accordingly. This point clearly connects to the observed-observer relationship that we have been pondering. He will understand this relationship and design his offsets and deceptive moves. Okay, back into our thinking in a general sense. If we want to think like the adversary thinks, we need people to use a variety of techniques such as 1. Thinking about duality, 2. Employing a person from the culture of your adversary to be your foe in wargaming, 3. Using a red team to challenge your assumptions and how you think like the adversary thinks, 4. Causing your wargaming to occur in a context that belches out random characteristics of nonlinearity. 5. Providing a group of technical, cultural, and military people to support the adversary leader and key thinkers. 6. Enabling the hypothetical adversary to possess the wherewithal and will to win in this wargame at any cost. Every adversary must perform some semblance of the above elements of a thought process model. Now, here's another way to see and sense his thinking process. To get into the adversary's mind, you must know the meaning of each process element or model of will and how it relates to the whole, that is, will. You want to enter his skin and travel through his mind, thus enabling you to see the world from his perspectives. I describe such a trip in my book as I imagine my hypothetical opponent's mind. See pages 329 through 330 and 356 through 357. This move enables you to approximate how to think like he thinks. Now, as we swing back to the adversary's mind, I believe that his critical thinking process should include even more detailed self-induced admonitions such as, be detailed and specific in my planning. Be wary as my enemy watches. Wargame my plan against the most capable foe who accurately represents my enemy's mind. Anticipate the appearance and outcomes of chance events. Develop flexible alternative plans with which to switch upon friction's appearance. Induce change that I want via actions and be sure to synchronize. Find and attack my adversary's links connecting his causes to effects directly, through action, or indirectly by link decay. Use multiple collectors to optimize my intelligence efforts. Think like my adversary and thus anticipate what he seeks with his intelligence systems. Show him what I want him to see. Establish counter-surveillance to deny the adversary access to my plans and intent. Anticipate how the adversary could be attempting to confuse or altering my co-evolutionary needs. Know the adversary will attempt to alter my assessment data so as to confound my efforts to adapt. Work the observed-observer relationship to my advantage. Leverage my advantages in a nonlinear context and minimize my disadvantages. Attack my adversary's contextual advantages and accentuate his disadvantages. Be ahead of my adversary's efforts to attack or manipulate my pressure points, decisive points, and centers of gravity. Think about disassembling my systems and processes to hide them throughout the chaotic cells of matrix war. It follows that wargaming our adversary's wargaming means that you have to be in his head and in his skin as he works his way through each of the above requirements. As another thought, learn to think as he thinks and shall act when he anticipates the mistakes that you could be making by committing logic and bias errors. And you have to think as he thinks you think that he thinks that you will be making logic and bias errors. Going even further, I want you to think how he intends to protect himself as he anticipates his own logic and bias errors that he thinks you will be attempting to exploit. As you go along with him, as you think that he thinks, and he wargames, you develop the adversary's intelligence requirements, counters, deceptive actions, and soft spots in how he is protecting his pressure points, decisive points, and centers of gravity. By using my methodology, you will be with him as he thinks about how you are thinking and acting. You will be in his mind as he develops his methods for imposing action to bring you to your knees as he thinks you will try to develop and enact counters to his action. With this entree into his mind, you can learn enough to attack his plans at their inception. Swinging back to our thinking, know that with respect to matrix war, in all vertical domain silos and at all horizontal levels of conflict troughs, work on identifying the adversary's intelligence operation that he intends to employ to feed his co-evolutionary adaptation requirements. Working through the obstacles appearing as he intends to resist your efforts to be superior in how you think, plan, decide, act, assess, and adapt. Anticipating how he could be wargaming observed-observer relationships. Forecasting how he wargames his options. Conjecturing how you think he thinks about how you intend to overcome your proclivity to err via bias and logic errors. Anticipating how he could attempt to manipulate your wargaming outcomes such as deception. With this knowledge from wargaming, the adversary's wargaming, you can now foresee the actions that you would take to negate all of his models and vignettes. So there you have it. I've given you a short explanation of this important notion. Wargaming the adversary's wargaming is one of the book's big and most important ideas. Wise people must study this notion of wargaming the adversary's wargaming and improve upon my emergent thinking. In my view, people who follow me will merge my wargaming and the adversary's wargaming theories with the evolution of artificial intelligence, avatars, and synthetic environments. We shall have the capability to use artificial intelligence to design synthetic environments and avatar adversaries. We shall have the capability to replicate the chance appearance of random characteristics of nonlinearity, necessarily problem sets, and avatar condition setting complete with causes connecting to links and effects. All of this man-machine capability can support our wargaming in an ordinary sense, and, as in my thinking about wargaming the adversary's wargaming. Such replication will thereby enable us to develop awesome deterrence. Or, if necessary, we can use these capabilities to neutralize any adversary, anytime, any activity, or in any place. Slide 12, operational context. Now we'll move on to a short explanation of my thinking about the operational context. This explanation of context is the first of three visuals and explanations. All three prove vital in a discussion of will because the context is where fights over supremacy of will occur. You will find this explanation about the operational context to be an addendum to what the United States Joint Staff calls the operational environment. To start our inquiry, we need a definition. Here's the short definition and just a few broadening thoughts that I use when thinking about context. Context is the set of situational influencers that surround, permeate, and influence one's thinking and the aggregated thinking of organizations. Context unfolds the activities of a particular event, the arena of action, the place where an operation unfolds, and subsumes any contestants in any contest of wills. Context often shapes and infuses intensity in any situation. Context constrains individual actions or groups and their collective thinking and actions. With this definition in mind, know that context is a sea of data way beyond what man can truly and fully know. Instead, a person's mind and their machines can know only parts of any context. Again, the context is important to our inquiry about will because of its influence on outcomes of clashes of will. The human mind picks up fragments and aspects of the context with the function of gaining perspective and processing the data that makes it into one's consciousness. Said minds, however, must be up to the task of deep thinking to enable what they seek in the sea of data to have the best probability of appearing. Interestingly, the data in the context that comes to people's minds can be noticeable or unnoticeable. Data, whether noticeable or unnoticeable, most often comes from the urging of a mental framework guiding focused collection and then sifting, selection, and storage of data. Incoming data can be passively ingested or it can be purposefully sought. Lots of data is ignored and either continues to exist or goes to the refuse dump of unused or worthless data. Once found and digested by the rational mind, one remains circumspect about this data. The guarded view of value of said data needed to gain understanding is often fragmented and most regularly lacks meaning until more thinking and machine work occurs to turn data into information. Incoming data can even be false owing to its nature or because it is deceptive and planted by an adversary. Being wary is a way to acknowledge that the data that people recognize as valuable is but a sliver of a constantly changing and shimmering whole of the data coming and going into one's subconscious and occasionally making it into consciousness. We realize that data comes to us through passive means by way of data absorption, but know that this data, for the most part, remains obscure and unnoticed. Remember, context always provides data inputs, some that each side seeks and uses or discards or stores, and some not sought but arriving anyway. Such inputs have significant potential for influencing opposing perspectives of contextual advantages and disadvantages peculiar to contesting entities. In our way of thinking about context, we must recognize and cope with the intermittent appearance of highly influential characteristics of nonlinear systems. We can cope with these characteristics with a nimble mind, nimble machines, and flexible organizations, as we know that in context housing conflicts, complexity theory is always present and its appearances often come with great surprise at the wrong place and the wrong time. On a positive note, knowing and recognizing their appearance and twisting these characteristics for our purposes can influence success in imposing one's will or denying the impositions of a competitor. This view of the operational context influences how adversaries might think about themselves. Such influence could affect how your adversary thinks you think about influences of the context. Such influence requires that you study each side's susceptibility to vagaries of nonlinear systems at play in each context. Such influence causes one to be watchful and aware of the fluctuating status of the fight for advantage inherent to encounters of varying size in any operational context. The context provides constant data to all sides in the struggle over will. Some of the data is welcome, but some of it comes as a surprise and is therefore not welcome because it can cause problems and turbulence. The appearance of unwanted data can even set conditions for failure, or at least is a cause for changes to one's thinking, planning, assumptions, and thus to one's operations. We can conclude that while the operational context presents opportunities to seize and exploit advantage, it remains fickle and can flit back and forth in the twinkling of an eye. I want you to think with me and realize a new idea. That is, if we learn to reason similarly to our adversary and understand his contextual layers and how he receives and processes context-push data, we can start to comprehend the beckoning of an indirect approach into their mind. Operations occur in the operational context. So here's the book definition of operation. It is an organized and concerted activity involving a number of people, especially members of the military or law enforcement, or competing people and organizations. An operation comes into action with aim, goals, objectives, resources, constraints, strategies, and so forth. Context proved to be constant motion and change. Humans and human-populated organizations move about in and out, up and down, and they sometimes conduct operations. They disturb the contextual universe via actions, transactions, interactions, and behaviors. Turbulence could also come from the context by way of weather. For example, weather bringing winds, thunderstorms, hail, rain, snow, ice, and so forth, along with natural phenomena such as earthquakes, tsunamis, forest fires, and the like. Disturbances in context can come as purposeful, such as induced expulsions of energy that human and human-populated organizations and their functions cause, and even their organizational communications and networks that connect and transact every second with other networks around the world. It follows that data exchanges between computers cause ripples in the sea of data. On a singular note, even when one computer transmits data and then receives data, both transactions disturb the context. Whether big or small, all disturbances come with expulsions of energy. Of interest to our inquiry, note that many of the causes for the effects we label as disturbances in the context leave physical and electronic traces. One can gather these traces or scrape them from the context and proceed to exploit the traces for intelligence analysis, which focuses on activities, transactions, interactions, and behaviors. One can say with a high degree of surety that large parts of any context remain hidden. Part of the context opacity comes from a veil of illusion that clouds the human eye and thus goes far in obscuring reality from human minds and their machines. Illusions distort what our eyes see and minds interpret, thereby causing a combined assault on our common senses, owing to the blinding and distorting influence of said illusions. It follows then, when the veil of illusion appears, it can cause the appearance and influence of a long string of logic and bias errors, or both. Of interest to us as an adversary makes his decisions, acts, assesses, evaluates subsequent data, and adapts, he too will be affected by the veil of illusion. But the influence of which I speak will cause a twisted view of reality from a curtain of illusion, stitched with patterns coming from their culture-influenced perceptions and subsequent thinking. This is the thinking that is vulnerable to exploitation in mental combat. Regardless, one can count on erring themselves, and they, in turn, can count on their adversary to err too. Just consider, indeed conjecture, how quickly anybody can experience a distortion of what they see, hear, perceive, sense, touch, smell, or intuit, but not necessarily realize the culprit of distortion is attributable to a veil of illusion. This distortion can come without the person making the error being aware of the distortion the veil causes. Now, let's move on to more discussion of context and pick up our thinking about aggregations. Brett. Slide 13, aggregations and context. My view of the operational context fits with the wonders of aggregation theory and its infolding and unfolding characteristics. We must start our inquiry into aggregation theory with two meaningful definitions to answer two questions. What is an aggregate and what is an aggregation? The definition of aggregate is one complex adaptive system, known as CAS, kludging with another and bonding via glue, which holds similar and dissimilar aggregates together. When more than one aggregate conjoins, one finds an aggregation. The definition of aggregation is gathering and bonding separate aggregates into a larger whole. This whole is collective and responsive to accepting more alike and disparate entities into its boundaries. Let us expound upon the theme, as aggregate and aggregation prove important to our understanding of the context housing struggles for the ascendancy of will. So I continue my explanation by stating something obvious by now. That is, when I add one aggregate with another aggregate, I have an aggregation. This statement is important for our understanding of context. Aggregations, their growth, and their ultimate disbandment always occur in context ignited by action coming from active characteristics at play in nonlinear systems. Aggregations can turn into unexpected consequences as some have velocity with mass, movement, and direction. They can keep growing in nonlinear contexts, unfolding smaller aggregations and unfolding into even larger aggregations. They can wreak havoc on any operation or turn good intentions into a firestorm. If they prove to be cloaked as such, they appear and disappear. Interestingly, aggregations influence operational context, hosting the outcomes in battles of will by being and not being. That is, being influenced by the null is a distinct possibility. Castes live in and operate in the operational context. They compete with one another, they try to use the context to their advantage, and each tries to cause disadvantages to fall on their competitor. In my book, castes include people and people populated organizations. They compete via coevolution, in which they act, assess their actions, collect assessment data, think about it via synthesis, evaluate, learn, and adapt. All of this takes place for each caste, but none more so than in competing castes who have to adapt faster and better than their adversary. This process is both a strength and weakness in each caste. In my book, I put forth the proposition that we must anticipate our adversary's attempts to attack our adaptation system while he protects his own. In my book, I propose that we should understand the adversary's coevolution and adaptation processes and either attack or manipulate the data our opponent's assessment system gathers and uses to adapt. The power of will in international conflicts and its theory about context involve four kinds of contexts that live and combine with one another. Remember, one caste is an aggregate, two castes are an aggregation. One aggregation plus another aggregation proves to be a larger aggregation. In a theoretical sense, I want you to see that human beings need to engage their minds in synthesis and holistic thinking to sense, see, feel, and judge various contexts coming to us or that we are moving about or within. The context of our inquiry can be permanent, semi-permanent, partially fluid, fluid, microcontext, and macrocontext as each unfolds and infolds within our contextual schema. Context may be physical or non-physical, tangible or intangible, visible or invisible, symmetrical or asymmetrical, harmonious or inharmonious, odorous or non-odorous, noisy or silent, and so on. Our individual, aggregate, and aggregations live within and move about in these four contexts that we are discussing. These contexts live within and they move about in and out of our individual and collective consciousness and subconsciousness. The more sensitive we become to such movements, the more advantages appear where none previously existed in our conscious minds. Culture drivers and shapers always prove important to context. For example, please remember that in cities, a relevant operational contextual feature is infrastructure and its many linear systems such as distribution arteries and centers, hospitals, icons, religious edifices, museums, schools, streetcars, trains, subways, water taxis, emergency rooms, highways, bridges, railroads, and so on. You get the picture. Slide 14, context continued. If more than one caste joins. Slide 15, characteristics of nonlinearity. Nonlinear systems can cause troubles as by definition they bring forth turbulence and change. Nonlinear means the study of situations where, in a general sense, cause and effect are not proportional to each other. That is, smaller causes can bring forth enormous and uncontrolled effects. The definition also suggests the presence of a certain strangeness when dealing with nonlinear systems and their influence on actions and counteractions in the operational context. I have thought about this strangeness, as the definition suggests, for years. Over time, I developed the 18 characteristics that you see on the screen. I believe that all of us need to use this list and understand it for preparing for the appearance and influence of one, two, or many of these characteristics. One of the most important characteristics is that I must acknowledge the persistent appearance of turbulence and change in any operational context housing fights over will to help me think. With turbulence and change, facts might not be facts, truth changes, plans can prove to be defunct, surprises come forth, small inputs can cause catastrophic consequences, and unexpected chance events wreak havoc with any force or activity. Let us further explore some of the characteristics I listed on the visual. Interestingly, Clausewitz and Unwar discussed nonlinearity, but in his words and his descriptions. Clausewitz discusses friction, randomness, chance, and falsity of information. In On War, Clausewitz says on page 119, everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. It is much the same in war. Countless minor incidences, the kind you never really foresee, combine to lower the general level of performance so that one always falls short of intended goals. Friction is the only concept that more or less corresponds to the factors that distinguish real war from war on paper. Clausewitz goes on to say on page 120, this tremendous friction, which cannot, as in mechanics, be reduced to a few points, is everywhere in contact with chance and brings about effects that cannot be measured just because they are largely due to chance. As one digs deeper into the subject of nonlinearity, you will conclude that you must ponder some of the most important characteristics relative to our discussion of operational context. So let's drive on. To win in contests of will, our minds and organizations have to be intellectually and structurally capable of dealing with unexpected chance events, which is friction in Clausewitz's thinking. These events come forth, often with surprise, because of the machinations of nonlinearity and, of course, man-induced changes coming as a result of coevolution and adaptation. I call these changes and happenings vagaries of the operational context. Important to our inquiry, we discover that as we plumb the depth of change and turbulence inherent to nonlinear context, we find at the root of all changes none other than nonlinear vagaries and their constant eruption, interference, and unpredictability commingling with the actions of man and their organizations striving to impose their will on their adversary. Let's say for the sake of argument that an adversary resists your imposition, and thus we find a conflict over imposition and denial of will. When this force, coming from the collision of forces of each side in a conflict, collides with the nonlinear aspect of the operational context, we can count on eruptions. Small inputs leading to large outputs, sensitive dependence on initial conditions leading to compounding errors in estimating change and turbulence. As you can see on the visual, I use these characteristics of nonlinearity to help me think about the operational context and my struggles with my foes. You can undoubtedly add more characteristics to the list. For example, at one time I had developed a list that reached the incredible number of 42 characteristics of nonlinearity. The list was unwieldy, thus I trimmed it and now work with 18 characteristics. Just be aware that your minds can and should add more considerations to this list. I have highlighted a few for your continued interest and attention. Please understand that not all of these characteristics will be at play at any one time. Their appearance, their entree into the lives and times of people and people-populated organizations, greatly influence all happenings in a conflict over will. This influence comes via turbulence, change, friction, and random events, as I described above, and we realize these happenings cannot be predicted with any accuracy simply because things do happen that are totally unexpected and that cause great stress and storm in any involved organizations and their populations of people. Being alert and aware, we take note that in any complex context in our work contains battling people and their organizations and machines. All people, machines, and organizations caught up in conflicts of will and within complex operational contexts shall suffer from the appearance and influence of these characteristics. These rumblings of change and turbulence prove highly influential as they can make truth to be false, black to be white, wrong to be right, and data to be both false and true. Because the context houses all the necessary ingredients needed in the recipe of chance, it is important and needs constant attention, indeed observance and study. For the context is also home to variables like pent-up emotion, resentment, and distrust of law enforcement smoldering for years and exploding suddenly in the Los Angeles riots in 1992. With these ingredients cooking in the context for several years, all it took for the variables to become sensitive was an acquittal of the police on trial after a brutal beating of Rodney King was caught on video camera. This acquittal and the pent-up and explosive hatred the populace of the Los Angeles community had for the police was the igniter for underlying variables. Some of the variables became sensitive and highly influential. These sensitive variables ignited the potential for the appearance of a plethora of unintended consequences. What we saw was a huge influence on the riots and the beatings and the fires. And we saw failed attempts to stop the riot, which could not be overcome because the aggregation was so huge, and it was the riot itself. If the lurking variables had been identified and worked with before the judicial decision, the riot might not have occurred. So the point of all this discussion is, in nonlinear contexts, small inputs can lead to unexpectedly large outputs. Therefore, search the context for variables that could become sensitive and take action to keep the variables from becoming sensitive, and also to set conditions to deal with potential problems before they become too big to influence. In such a context, players on the stage of strife know with a sinking sense of dread of the presence and influence of randomness. Random means arbitrary. With arbitrariness comes the realization of the impossibility to predict random events with accuracy. Random happenings come to human beings as whimsical, capricious, and oh so difficult to deal with. Yet such events are certain to happen during contests of will, owing to the characteristics of nonlinearity, the presence and influence of such constants of inconsistencies such as weather, and the presence of humans and their organizations and machines disturbing the universe, that is, the operational context, and reaping the crop of turbulence and change. Also, I might add, the operational context of nonlinear systems are home to CAS, and they have a presence and influence on all actions within an operational context. Please recall that CAS involve people and people-populated organizations. As another reminder, a CAS is a dynamic network of many agents, which represent cells, species, individuals, firms, nations, acting in parallel, constant acting and reacting to what other agents are doing. This definition comes from Mitchell Waldrop's book, Complexity. CAS comprise aggregations. Aggregations can grow and grow into one or more huge aggregations with hundreds of CAS bonding, and the outcome being that when in the context we find conjoining of like and disparate people, organizations, and their equipment. All come together, all the pieces matter, and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Aggregations thus bear watching, as the whole of the aggregation or even a small aggregation of CAS can prove to be one of the variables that can become sensitive and to start moving and bonding with other aggregations. Aggregations influence via the appearance and activation of several characteristics of nonlinearity, with one being small inputs can lead to unexpectedly large outputs. 2. Sensitive dependence on initial conditions. 3. The presence and influence of CAS. And 4. The presence and influence of aggregations and aggregation theory. Aggregations sometimes become unexpectedly large, groups of people, equipment, organization, thoughts, social media, and so forth. It is no wonder that contestants in the conflict over superiority of will believe they are starstruck when bad things start to happen, and, as if guided by an invisible hand, their plans, actions, and operations are adversely affected by unexpected events and happenings. One finds in such contests that success often goes to the side with the best leadership, the best agility of mind, and the best agility of organizations and machines. All castes live through continuous cycles of coevolution. Coevolution means the evolution of two or more species or organisms, man or natural, that interact closely with one another, with each adapting to changes in the others. Note, all castes must and do co-evolve. In the logic of the book, castes use this thought model to thrive or die, act assessed actions, design assessment observables, collect assessment data, turn data into information, and information into knowledge, evaluate, learn, and adapt. This means that organisms, which we call castes, living or acting in the operational context, interact and compete with one another, with each adapting to variations in others. All castes must co-evolve and adapt or die. My theory is that co-evolving castes will always follow the sequence I just described to successfully co-evolve and adapt. Nevertheless, the battle of the quality of the cycle shall rage in all areas of the contextual battle bubble. Those who perform the fastest and the best always have an open door to the 7 advantages we have been talking about, starting with initiative. Those castes that perform the worst shall not only lose, but most probably shall die. It follows that this sequence has 2 phases. The first phase allows for viewing the context and one's opponents and watching for reaction to your action. With practice, the caste can assess, learn, and adapt faster and better than the adversary. The second phase, though, opens a door of vulnerability. That is to say, assessment and evaluation of assessment data are subject to false data, to manipulated data, to data laced with inputs designed to fire up emotions, and to thus open another door, that is the door holding back bias and logic errors. Now we move forward on our journey. As the next step, we shall engage in deep thinking about the role of culture as it affects caste rules and models of action, such as how cultural rules affect a combatant's caste's assessment of the context and its adversaries. Slide 16, role of culture on complex adaptive systems. In any struggle of clashing wills, colliding castes and their coevolution and adaptation contribute to the realization that truth can change in any operational context. Keeping this fixation of the fluctuation of truths in mind, let's think about that which guides and controls castes and their actions through adaptation. Within each colliding caste, one finds action models that shape the nature of action, hence imposition for one's will. But going even deeper, one finds cultural rules that guide and constrain and unleash the types and targets of caste actions. It is within the rules that one can start to understand the purpose, strength of motive, and selection of capabilities. Thus, this peek into the engines of will proves valuable indeed. While many things in cultural change, its rules governing behavior, punishments, death, birth, marriage, religion, and so forth seem stable. But even stable cultural rules can bend and sometimes snap into winds of change brought forth with the chaos of nonlinear operational context. Disturbances in any operational context happen with impositions of will by actions, reactions to attempted imposition actions, and from coevolution activities of castes. Again, I advise you to keep the 18 characteristics of nonlinearity in mind, such as friction, randomness, presence, and influence of sensitive variables, importance of context, and so forth. I want you to understand an interesting consistency of data inputs that you will face. That is, the arrival of both wanted and unwanted data. 4 guiding forces drive caste actions. First, castes must act, assess, collect assessment data, evaluate the data, learn, and adapt. Thus, action and adaptation must occur to survive or to accomplish aims, goals, and objectives. Castes have rules that account for demands that they co-evolve and adapt. Second, rules guide and influence action models, leading to particular kinds of actions, outputs of action, assessment, and adaptation activities. This process is alive and thrives with our adversary's intelligence system providing the data to guide the rule-driven action model and its strokes designed to impose one's will on the right spot at the right time with the right force to achieve the desired effect. And of course, this intelligence system must provide assessment, evaluation, and adaptation conclusion recommendations. Thus, it should be clear by now that the adversary's coevolution and adaptation system should be a first priority target in any struggle of wills. Third, rules serve to drive, guide, and constrain the activities of castes. A rule for our purposes is a principle or structure of behavioral code governing and influencing the models that shape actions. Guidance that governs, binds, influences, and leads models to direct caste actions that may in turn impose one caste's will on another. Fourth, caste rules and models are subject to influence by data coming from the operational context in 2 ways, wanted and unwanted. Know that rules shape requirements and models purposefully directing data gathering via intelligence collection. Also, the context imposes unwanted data, often at the worst possible time. Sometimes its input into decision cycles and well-being of castes could cause failure if the recipients of the intrusion were not inured to such surprise by data inputs coming from the context. Other things rules do include the following. As one thought, rules dictate the connectedness you see as my four kinds of contexts merge: individual, mini-individual, macro-small, and macro-large. As another thought, rules dictate the kind of action the cast takes. Know that decision makers, planning people, and operations people implement will via the rules, models of action, and the selection of particular kinds of action, assess outcomes, evaluate collected data, learn, and adapt. Continue with this line of thought. Rules govern how people think, good and bad. Thus, I say, first identify cultural rules, then successfully affect the rules, and then you can affect the way people think. If you feed the rule-driven cast assessment and adaptation system, you can affect outcomes of thought. Take a moment and think of the power of cultural rules. They serve as a basis for how to think about the requirements to select the kind of incoming data and with it gathering and presentation attribute meaning. This action, powerful as it is, as it applies a degree of meaning as data transforms into information. This is a man-machine process. These rules dictate needs to the action models, then filter the action results, outputs to the assessment of actions, evaluating data coming in, learning by sharing, and adapting faster and better than an adversary. It follows this process of which I speak starts with cultural rules, knows their influence on action models in human minds, and because of their influence on the entire process of coevolution, rules and action models become a huge target. It became apparent to me that there is a way to identify 6 principles as I work to understand the context prior to, during, and after engaging an opponent in a battle of wills. 1. Influence your adversary's views of context, but you have to know and understand his culture and how it affects his thinking before you can influence his views. Turbulent disturbances come forth as change agents. They affect people's cultural-laden system of beliefs and values. Such influence gives rise to using the adversary's culture to gain advantages. Turbulence affects operational context and casts operating therein. Within a changing context, I envision a host of probabilities appearing and disappearing. Cultural rules shape both appearance and selection of the probabilities. One probability involves seeking, finding, and changing an adversary's influential but nascent and fragile rules. These rules prove important because they guide action models that the thinking people use first to strike and then to evaluate outcomes from assessment data. Some of them can lead to advantages and disadvantages, so you must be careful about choice of affecting the right possibilities. On the other hand, most of the time, trying to affect long-standing rules will prove difficult to succeed, and often the attempt ends in failure. But there are many rules to work with in this model of adversary casts and their inner workings. These workings come from the influence of culture. Consequently, rules have a significant influence on the actual outcomes of conflicts as each contestant sees and thinks about the aftermath of a collision of wills. Thus, the planning person must take into account the influence of rules and wisely choose the most influential of rules to attack. That is, each side has to evaluate their rule vulnerability, protect theirs, and attack their foes, of course. Perhaps a person might try to attack a rule that appears the strongest at the start of the struggle, during lulls, and even in a standoff. Attacking the strong rules as you attack the weaker and more nascent rules might work. Let me explain a little more. Knowing that there is a weakening of the old rules and disturbances in the context, while the nascent is wreaked. Perhaps we can work on the strongest rules so as to weaken the strong and suggest to the vulnerable minds that the weak is too fragile to live. With such thinking, we aim for and influence acceptance and use of different rules more to our liking and potential use. Our sought-after rule is more to our liking as it could influence the thinking that goes into the cast action models. The new rule could affect the selections of actions, the thinking that goes into the expected outcomes, the design of assessment observables, the choice of collection system to gather sought-after assessment data, assessment output, and the subsequent output and interpretation of assessment data. Thus, the strategy also affects how the adversary evaluates assessment data. It also affects how the adversary cast learns from its evaluation of assessment data. Affecting the rule could very well influence and the thinking that goes into interpretation and judgment of where coevolution efforts sit after the action occurs. This rule could influence the thinking and the sharing of lessons learned from the synthesized information as it moves into knowledge. We know such knowledge development to be biased and subject to logic and bias errors in thinking and conclusions. Thus, each sentient entity uses offsets to account for a penchant to err in their thinking because of logic and bias errors and influences. And finally, influencing one or more models that will affect thinking processes could have a remarkable influence on the thinking that goes into adaptation. 2. Influence how he thinks about your culture influences how you think about your advantages and disadvantages. This includes the cultural inputs to logic and bias errors in your thinking and what you do about this proclivity that exists in all human beings. Ponder how he considers how you think and be prepared to reinforce this notion to gain any kind of an advantage. 3. Think about how he thinks relative to the nature of context and the culture and its unwanted and wanted data inputs. Seek weak inputs and prepare to attack or manipulate them. 4. Think about the vastness of the macro context that encompasses your world, which is a small conflict, but one that congeals and connects to larger and larger context, which enfold and affix with even larger context. Contemplate the whole of the macro-large context along with the macro-small context, the micro context, and the individual context. 5. Anticipate and affect how the adversary's culture sways rules, guiding and controlling class action models to your advantage. 6. Attack and disperse the congealing aggregations that come with chaos and that have the potential to provide your adversary with positional advantage and certainly enable him to have access to initiative, tempo, and momentum advantages. It is a good place to attack or manipulate the adversary's intelligence system. Seizing advantages from the context and denying the adversary similar power can lead to your ascendancy to superiority in bouts of will. Attacking your adversary's efforts to co-evolve can lead to victory. This aspect of struggles for will cannot be ignored. Within the operational context, one finds advantages and disadvantages for each side. Attack or manipulate your adversary's advantages and extend the life of his disadvantages, but always anticipate his attacks on your advantages and protect yourself. Exploitation and denial of attempts to gain advantages appear from the context. It holds signals and hints as to the nature of conflicting attempts to exploit and win. Of course, one finds the culture at work in everything that happens within the context. It permeates, or should permeate, all thinking, plans, actions, assessments, and adaptations for yourself and for your adversary. Yes, our best and brightest must not only think about this process from their perspectives, but also their opponents' perspectives. My approach to winning in contests of will demands that you think about how the adversary thinks about your thinking, acting, and eventually adapting. This approach demands that you relate to the cultures involved in influencing entities in the fray, such as national and international rules of engagement and your adversary's constraints, if any exist. My thoughts and explanations must be in any discussion of context. Specifically, I ask that you include will's definition. Along with definition, I want you to comprehend the presence and influence of turbulence and change. I ask that you recognize the power of culture in all that happens and what you think. I want you to recognize and work with cultural rules that guide actions, thinking, assessment, evaluation, and adaptation. Always think about the appropriate application of the list of 18 characteristics of nonlinearity. Seek to identify and leverage the advantages and disadvantages coming forth from the context and acknowledge your susceptibility to vagaries of the context. I ask you to learn to wargame the adversary's wargaming, immersing your mind in his highly influential culture. You will need to employ people of your adversary's cultural background to act as your adversary and to critique your thinking. Your goal is to get into his mind, understand the importance of his culture, recognize the power of his cultural rules and his class action models, and learn his thinking as he attempts to use context to gain and hold 1, 2, or all 7 advantages. I ask that you work with the 14-element thought model of will relative to the adversary and to the context at hand. Always consider how the adversary's culture influences him as he works with the 14-element thought model. The arrow of time and these 14 elements always end up immersed in the culture. Slide 17, thinking effectively about will. In this portion of the discussion, I will be thinking with you about the following subjects. Slide 19, thinking about the adversary of the mind's eye. Imagination, the most important aspect of thinking. It was Albert Einstein who said, imagination is more important than knowledge. I believe we have to imagine the adversary's mind's eye so as to influence it. A mind's eye is a human being's inner sanctum of thought. It is where one imagines and visualizes the thoughts that the rational mind provides and commingles it with data fragments and shards streaming into the sanctum via one's senses, through one's bodily portals into the quiet inner refuge of one's private thoughts. The mind's eye provides entree into one's undermind, where the fragments, shards, and shreds of data swirl and sometimes collide with rational thought and imagination, the upper mind in our thinking. But sometimes these seemingly meaningless shreds of data make it into the upper mind to turn into meaning. Please note I have extrapolated and borrowed some of the ideas of Guy Claxton from his book Harebrained Tortoise Mind, published in 1997, in this depiction of the human mind. One's mind's eye is a gatekeeper, a guardian, as it were, precluding the upper mind from being overwhelmed by the massive amounts of data one subsumes into the undermind. This role presents opportunities for entering and striking or influencing the adversary's mind's eye and protecting yours. It is via the adversary's mind's eye where you can attack adversary plans at their inception. It is through the mind's eye that one can see the world as the adversary sees it, and thus grasp his or her perspectives and perceptions. It is where life force lives and dreams of passion, desires, retribution, hatred, love, fears live and blow around in the vastness of the mountains, plains, and swamps that form the human mind, the oh so wonderful human mind. It is via the mind's eye in which one finds the adversary's inner sanctum and high country. With this discovery, you can now discover how to approach several onerous tasks. Some of these tasks include understanding how he thinks, what he thinks, and why he thinks. You also consider how his logic and bias areas, culture, education, perspectives of technology, and worldview affects his mind. Several important elements condition one's mind's eye. As a few, consider the influence of will, culture, education, worldview, experience, intellect, view of you, view of technology, view of the operating context, mythos, value, social mores, rules, and emotions, and so on. It is here, in one's mind's eye, where the true seeker can find the inception of thought. One can find the starting point in which opponents choose to capitulate or to do battle to win wars of wits and bouts of mental combat for triumph of one's will. Now we'll move on to greater specificity in how to think about any adversary's mind's eye. Slide 21, thinking like the adversary thinks. Mental combat is a given as we think about our adversary. Of course, this has been true since the beginning of man's conflicts with other mankind. But in this age, mental combat is even more important than ever. As a first step, here's the definition of mental combat. It is the constant multi-domain, multi-level, multispectral cognitive conflict or competition in which people with conflicting interests attempt to impose their will via superior mental functioning. The book makes a few early statements that you should recall. That is, mental combat exists and functions under a larger umbrella of connected wars of wits. This means that as one moves vertically up, say, a chain of command and level of operation, that each level is involved in increasingly larger and more complicated wars of wits. But venture your gaze in a horizontal way around and at a standoff, and you will find large aggregations of wars of wits that, of course, house a vast variety of bouts of mental combat. One can claim, of course, that we cannot enter our adversary's mind and know exactly what he is thinking and preparing to do, nor can we know with precision how he will react when we do something, or how he can initiate action and do something to cause our reaction. Regardless of difficulty, we have to learn to think like the adversary and beat him. Yes, we have to enter his skin and his mind. We have to travel in his mind and see the world as he sees it, and in particular, his perspective on himself and us relative to conflict. So, you might ask, what are the basics of outthinking the adversary? After all, he seems to hold all the advantages, such as knowing his culture, speaking its language, and often knowing the physical context better than us. The answer to the question can be found in this list of things one must do to outthink their adversary. 1. Know his 14-element model for thinking about will, or facsimile thereof. 2. Know the kind of conflict he knows that he has embarked upon. 3. Understand his thought model for thinking about the overall situation. The how to think thought model I use involves 21 elements: strategic aim, goals, objectives, constraints, resources, strategies, tactics, will, coevolution and adaptation, duality and pendulum thinking, adversary wargaming, 13-element model to enrich his thinking, advantages and disadvantages, logic and bias errors, pressure points, decisive points, centers of gravity, understanding of nonlinearity, understanding the nature of operational context, engaging in mental or matrix war, and so on. Know the situational, operational, and political context in which he plans to compete. 5. Understand his previous behavior, his culture, his worldview, his travel in and out of his country, his views and proficiency in technology. 6. Know his coevolution and adaptation cycle and the system he uses to collect assessment data of sufficient value so as to evaluate his actions and adapt. We can also work into our perspectives and how we think by considering and using the following thoughts. As a first step, by recognizing that we compete with an unpredictable adversary helps you to be agile in mind and organizational processes. This adversary will do things that you don't expect. The unexpected causes cognitive dissonance. This means that in our work, to be aggressive and anticipatory to gain the initiative, that we shall sometimes fail. As a second step, in understanding that we compete in a context that houses two kinds of systems. One involves linear systems. They can be quite stable. Their monitoring allows us to know and protect the most important linear systems relative to the conflict, context, culture, and of course, the adversary, while comprehending impending chance events in nonlinear systems. The other system is nonlinear, but the nonlinear system is, for the most part, impenetrable, turbulence-prone, unpredictable, full of variables, and full of big and small complex adaptive systems, all of which co-evolve with their competitors. They co-evolve with action followed by rigorous assessment. They collect data pertaining to outcomes of action. They evaluate assessment data, learn, and adapt. Many other characteristics of nonlinearity appear in the book and in this briefing, so please recognize that these are but a few. As a third step toward intellectual redemption and preparation for mental combat, one always helps themselves by sensing and recognizing the presence of influential sensitive variables. In a nonlinear system, variables prove plentiful and influential. If a variable becomes sensitive, it can cause immense and unexpected change. Variables become sensitive because of one or more causes for the effect have stimulated the variable, and it becomes sensitive. The causes for the effect in question can be found in the operational context. Thus, effective searches for the lurking causes in question can be anticipated, located, and neutralized. As a fourth step, when overcoming our adversaries via thought models, concepts, and methods of problem solving that the reader finds in my book, one should be setting the conditions for success in mental combat and wars of wits. A model helps our minds consider a projected reality. This reality, composed of understandable characteristics, helps us to discern what our adversary could be after as the model plays out. The model must be restless and in motion, always adapting to operational contexts and the actions of opponents, but never in isolation from other influences of outcome of conflict. We'll now turn to a different slide, slide 22, that shows a thinking process model that will help people learn how to think deeply and ably with sufficient to engage and win in any contest of will. Slide 22, thinking model for adaptive adversaries. This is what any complex adaptive system, or CAS, does, whether individuals competing or organization, countries, aggregations of people, and organizations and machines. All struggling adversaries have some interesting commonalities. For example, 1. People want to win. 2. People try to impose their will on others for a distinct purpose. 3. People who are the targets of impositions of another person's will either capitulate or resist. 4. Resistors possess a calculus to help think whether or not to contest an attacker's efforts to impose his will and win. 5. If a resistor refuses to capitulate or to strike a deal, a conflict unfolds. Then the resistor's version of the 14-element model of will kicks in full blast. Now, I ask that you take a look at the visual. It is an easy model to follow because it is numbered 1 through 13. I venture to say all people in struggles of will follow some semblance of this sequence if they hope to be sufficiently organized and adequately cerebral to design and aggressively seek aims, goals, objectives, and so on. The model could have either more elements or some could be taken away. They are hypotheticals, but I believe most of these elements shall appear in various forms to be at play in any contest or clash of wills. This model also reflects my emphasis on coevolution and adaptation with its rules and thought models. Coevolution always involves actions, assessing outcomes of action, evaluating outcomes, learning, and adapting. Each competing organism wants to perform such tasks better and faster than their adversaries in a race to successfully impose their will on the foe who is attempting to do likewise to them. The sequencing of necessary elements in thoughts come out loud and clear. Anybody, including ourselves, go through some kind of a thinking journey if they are in a struggle of wills. What you see in this visual is how I see people thinking in a struggle of wills. Thus, it is critically important to use this model to hone your own thinking. But more importantly, one has to use the model to attack their opponent in mental combat. They must use a semblance of the model to win the war of wits that its struggles will entail. Let's talk about each of the elements just a little. 1. Perceive. We have to understand that we perceive and what influences the purity of the snapshot of meaning and time. This is where desire begins. This is where life force and resolve come into being and bring to light and focus on a distinct want or desire. 2. Think. Perceive does not mean think. We have to think about what our senses have perceived or scoped or received by way of data inputs that are sought or provided by the context. 3. Plan. After thinking, one has to plan. A plan involves some semblance of aim, goals, objectives, resources, constraints, strategies, tactics, analysis of will, pressure points, decisive points, centers of gravity, observed-observer relationships, operational context, and so on. 4. Decide. The leader has to approve or disapprove the plan. Normally, a good leader will tweak the plan because he or she were involved in its process. This is where one finds the planners and leader talking about purpose for the upcoming impositions of will. 5. Act. An imposition of will comes via one's capabilities. Along with capabilities, one finds strength of motive, feeding energy to passion, sacrifice, perseverance, determination, advantage, disadvantage. 6. Assess. The organism is a cast. It is competing. Thus, when it acts, it must judge how well it is doing relative to its opponents and to its aim, goals, objectives, and so forth. Thus, the organism assesses the activities in the operational context. 7. Design observables. Advanced and skilled intelligence analysts design, direct, interpret, and synthesize data, information, and knowledge. They decompose their requirements, study the context, and develop observables for use in their collection systems. The output in our current thinking is that the observables will relate to assessment requirements and thus suggest further actions and then guide the collections to gather subsequent data, so it goes. 8. Collect assessment data. The collections and analysis partnership work as a connected unity in planning and executing intelligence operations. It produces assessment data relative to one's actions to impose his or her will or to deny another person's efforts to impose his will on you. 9. Recompose data into information. As data arrives, machines and people recompose the data into information. Information has meaning, but is often neither organized nor combined to a high level of quality, but it leads to knowledge. 10. Synthesize information into knowledge. Analysts synthesize information into knowledge. With current and accurate knowledge, one can lower risk, but it takes time for the human mind to synthesize information into knowledge. Also, knowledge has a short time life of accuracy and relevancy, so decisions on synthesized knowledge have to be quick and well aimed. 11. Evaluate the knowledge. Leaders and the red team people challenge assumptions and the thinking of intelligence analysts. They must answer the question, does this product, conclusion, and recommendations come from deep, sound thinking? 12. Learn. The conclusions and after-action reviews move around and help other people of similar ilk to correct what might have been wrong or use the knowledge coming their way to help in their own fight. 13. Adapt. Then the organism adapts, keeping the overarching goal in mind and thus acting better and faster than their adversary. Then the organism does, in fact, adapt and change or move. Accordingly, I'm hoping this visual is self-evident in your minds. But in my experience, people sometimes fail to think about their thinking in this way. To pile on, people don't think about their adversaries' thought models relative to their own thought models in the battles over quality of thinking they're in. This kind of mental combat is important. Therefore, mastering mental combat and actually forcing one's mind to perform these functions in a disciplined way enables you to win in any domain, at any level of conflict, at any time, at any place. Using these methods of thinking and acting provides you with the wherewithal to win in mental combat and wars of wits. Such thinking contributes to your leader's will to ascend to impose their will over one or more of their adversaries. But I still hear some grousing. A few readers or listeners are whispering that there is more to this problem than easily meets the eye. I say, yes, there is more, and I'll talk about the more now. Again, this visual shows how this adversary perceives, thinks, plans, decides, acts, assesses, develops observables for assessing, collects, recomposes data into information, synthesizes information into knowledge, evaluates, learns, and adapts. He is under immense pressure to adapt faster and better than his opponent. Our situation will be more than it appears to be if you ponder the influence of culture on your opponent's thinking. In particular, think deeply and find current knowledge about his religion, attunement to law and order, and his public and private thoughts. Also know his societal rules and their influence on his thought models for action. Consider your opponent's education, circle of friends, worldview, travel experiences, work, family, social mores of the context the opponent grew up in and in which he works or has worked. Consider his worldview and travel experience. How does he view strangers? How does he view people who are not part of his religion? How does he treat minorities such as women? Consider his view of technology and how adept he is with both phones and computers, as well as his tendency to use the internet for business and for fun. These are but a few of the questions and wonderings we have to consider, as answering them and many other thoughts and questions about our adversary can result in success or failure. I'm convinced that great leaders do think this way, the way of this 13-step thought model. But our challenges in mental combat and wars of wits prove so demanding that we cannot just leave it up to great leaders anymore. They need very smart helpers who are trained and educated to meet the challenges of modern struggles over will. In my view, it is imperative to think about the adversary and how he thinks about will and how he thinks you think about will. The 14-element model is now extant in your minds. As one of the book's big ideas, the model helps us think about the adversary's view of his will and how we need to think about ours and his views of will and the ensuing struggles over its ascendancy. While the visual is obvious, it is difficult to perform as suggested. Why? First, our own biases, egos, backgrounds, experiences, education, cultural influences, arrogance, values, and so on, or get in our way. Then our thinking becomes clouded by a veil of illusions we talked about before. This veil obscures reality with illusions such as the illusion of personal grandeur. Our troubles also come forth by how we think or do not think. We sometimes struggle to think clearly and well because we become fixated on our intentions at the expense of recognizing that a foe exists. The foe in the nonlinear context cause unexpected disturbances that our minds must understand and adjust to as needed. Additionally, know well that your foe will often parry your imposition and carry his action, his imposition of his will against you to win and to cause you to lose. After all, he is a thinking and acting foe who wants to impose his will on us or deny our imposition of will on him. What do we need to help us learn how to think about our foe so as to set the conditions for successfully imposing our will on any foe, any time, any place, in any domain or level of conflict? As I have said repeatedly, We need to learn how to think using thought models, professional red team people who challenge our ideas, assumptions, identify your logic and bias errors, and lead you to self-examination via introspection. Also, we must learn to think holistically through integration, horizontal thinking, and learning how to call forth and use the art of synthesis. Technically, we need realistic synthetic environments, very smart artificial intelligence driven avatars, powerful and linked computers and players for our wargaming, our wargaming and his. Also, as I have said many a time in this discussion, winning will be difficult. To win in mental combat and wars of wits, one has to get a grip on the presence and influence of the culture and ethnicity of our adversary. As I discussed above, all of us need to understand our adversary's views of his thought processes that any thinking adversary has to employ so as to win in struggles of will. As a starting point, you engage his mind in deep thinking so as to learn his strategic aim, goals, objectives, constraints, resources, strategies, tactics, will, coevolution, adaptation, duality and pendulum thinking, adversary wargaming, his 13-element model of thinking, his advantages and disadvantages, his logic and bias errors, pressure points, decisive points, centers of gravity, understanding of nonlinearity, his understanding of the nature of the operational context, how he engages in matrix war, and you can go on and on. We need to know how he thinks about his and our wills, but also the advantages rendered by the operational context, and how he plans to cope with the chaos associated with nonlinear context. A tall order, but doable. I deal with this chapter throughout the book, and in particular in one chapter, chapter 14, The Thinking Adversary. Slide 23, Matrix War. I've stumbled onto something new as I wrote the book. The new idea is what I call Matrix War. I want to explain it to you in brief terms. As I thought about conflict relative to struggles over will, it came to my mind that I could explain wars of will and clashes over imposing and denying will in another way. It is a way of a matrix that came forth in my mind as I labored on will. Matrix war, as the way battles of will play out, is truly one of the most important ideas in the book, but quite abstract. In the book, I turn the abstract into concrete thought. As I pondered will as a phenomenon, I found that I need to be more expansive and deeper in my thinking relative to how conflicts over will occur and where they occur. Upon diving into the well of introspection, I discovered that I had missed two thoughts, and their absence limited my comprehension of struggles over will. I've worked hard to fix what I had missed. First, I envisioned how struggles over will always involve parts and pieces. For example, consider as wholes the sub-elements of weapon systems and their objects and elements, such as communication systems, missiles, radars, internet systems, logistics, humans and their needs, robots, sensors, computers, data, tanks, helicopters, artillery, maintenance functions and elements, command and control organizations, physical, and knowledge production organizations, virtual. Consider that effectiveness means that all elements must come together, act, then disband. This conjoining and disbanding must be done in an orchestrated and synergistic manner. What we find is a dance from separate do-si-do to whole do-si-do, then back to separate. Contemplate how the elements interact and struggle against the adversary counterparts, lookalikes, mirror imaging functions, and actions in their own right. It occurred to me that these struggles over will occur not as a huge whole, but in scattered senses, in any context, but able to aggregate and perform as commanded on call. But, as I mentioned, the scattered nature of wholes can converge for purposes of striking as a synchronized whole force. But this whole, as a combination of minds and organizations and the elements of which I speak, realize its vulnerability when it is together, operating as a whole. Thus, the disassembled whole is much safer in a scattered sense. However, know well that the parts and pieces of the disassembled whole must be able to come together at the right place and right time to achieve a state of synergy and thus be optimally effective. The meme "move divided and strike united" comes to mind as an aid to think about the scattered nature of a whole that is not antithetical to the whole's purpose, capabilities, and strength of motive. After accomplishing its mission, this whole disassembles. In my thinking, the parts and pieces of the whole of a mobile surface-to-surface missile could be found in multiple and sometimes odd places. The parts and pieces of systems, I determined in my thinking, could be found in multiple horizontal levels of conflict troughs and in several vertical domain silos. It came to me that the connecting pieces on all sides in conflicts of wills purposefully converge or careen, and sometimes do so by accident owing to Clausewitzian friction. Second, I had to expand the 5 domains the U.S. military uses as a theoretical construct for its doctrine. Note, the domains the United States military recognizes today involve air, ground, sea, space, and cyber. Yes, while the extant 5 domains still proved relevant, I discovered 2 missing domains. I found that I had to add information and cognition to enable the vertical sequencing sufficient to synchronize well with the levels of conflict, even when acting in partial, complete, or scattered small holes that belong to much larger holes. An example could be a transporter erector launcher, a TEL, in a mobile surface-to-surface missile system. When assembled in whole, it is capable of accurately launching a nuclear weapon. With this in mind, I could now begin envisioning these 7 domains as vertical domain silos cutting through 4 horizontal levels of conflict troughs. These 4 horizontal levels of conflict troughs include tactical, operational, strategic military, and strategic policy. The result is, of course, cells, 28 cells to be more precise. To get my mind to rise to the level of abstraction necessary to visualize the intersection of vertical silos with the horizontal levels of conflict troughs, I thought this process as scythe cuts. Now, I ever so clearly envision 7 vertical domain silos, air, ground, sea space, cyber, information, and cognition, slicing into horizontal levels of conflict troughs, always 4 to my way of thinking. Again, these horizontal levels of conflict troughs are strategic policy, strategic military, operational, and tactical. Know that a total of 28 cells come forth and appear. Know that it is in these cells where the struggles over will occur. These cells exist in all conflict involving will. The vertical domain silos and the horizontal levels of conflict troughs exist as living entities shimmering and energy emitting holes. They are microaggregations and macroaggregations connecting to other entities, but always at each of the aggregation's cores, one finds these 28 cell matrices. It was in this deep thinking trance that I had a vision of a matrix whose cells house conflicts over will. With deep thinking, I concluded that life force, purpose, strength of motive, capabilities, and timing drive the size and duration of the clashes in and through the 28 cells. This, ladies and gentlemen, is matrix war. Next, let us back up and think about the matrix of which I speak in its most basic form. Slide 24, more thoughts about the matrix. Slide 25, connectedness in matrix war. Slide 26, connections, cogs and vertical domain silos. Right from the start of the discussion about this slide, I want to make a proposition. That is, clashes over will occur not in one cell, but in multiple connected cells. Though, too, I believe there are multiple centers of gravity, or cogs, in each cell, at each level, important to each battle, engagement, and campaign. But, of course, there will always be fewer cogs than either decisive points, DPs, or pressure points, PPs, even though all 3 of these connect. So effect 1, an education occurs in all of the connected family. Let's think further on this proposition. Parts, pieces, and elements of cogs can exist in each cell among many cells, but chances are no cogs appear as easy to find, packaged, and contained entities. Instead, the subparts and subpieces will appear and link to the whole that is a cog. These parts and pieces will be scattered throughout the 28 cells that are matrix war. The parts and pieces of the disassembled cogs appear to our senses as vestiges, as standing physical presences, as moving appearances, as assemblages in hiding, or as ghostly nascent imprints on the walls of caves. Each are wholes unto themselves, thus we think of them as aggregates and aggregations, particularly when they start connecting with other aggregations. Thus, what we have in our minds is an operational context housing and hiding the pieces and parts of disassembled cogs. This context is shifting, shimmering, and changing. I also acknowledge a presence. It is the presence of a bedeviling effect of the appearance and influence of one or more of the many characteristics of nonlinearity that cause turbulence and change that wreak havoc on these assemblages, often in hiding. Cogs and their parts and pieces scatter to remain obscure from prying eyes or to actually hide. The particular cog's nature dictates its relationships with the wholes and assemblages in hiding, training, securing, and assembling on call within their contextual bubbles. The parts and pieces of holes must hide and, when beckoned, congeal for the sake of optimizing missions. The result is a matrix, alive with energy, purpose, strength of motive, and always vulnerable to friction, mistakes, small inputs and large outputs, randomness, and so on. We recognize that certain kinds of activities exist and connect to one another at all levels of war and in all domains of conflict. To cause the greatest effects on any adversary, one has to assault, tangibly or intangibly, the adversary's multiple, vertical, and horizontally connected cogs with optimally grouped weapon systems. Upon searching for and being guided by higher level reasoning about aggregation analysis, one finds with deep thinking aggregations of capabilities and probabilities. But their smaller and larger pieces stretch and connect across levels within domains of conflict. Any cog has related parts that are smaller but attached to larger cogs and other related parts roughly similar to one another, yet remaining somewhat different in size, capabilities, limitations, and vulnerabilities. Interestingly, if one desires to influence the adversary's vision for winning, I submit that one must reason holistically and relationally across, I repeat across, vertical domain silos of conflict as well as up and down horizontal levels of conflict troughs. The search for cogs, decisive points, and pressure points has to occur via this kind of connectedness. Let us reason a bit more about this notion. Actions occur in vertical domain silos and horizontal levels of warfare troughs, but these actions relate, in fact, and connect. Thus, affecting a cog at one level can affect other cogs in other silos and at other conflict troughs. Thus, an action in one place not only affects cogs in the vicinity of that particular location, but also influences cogs at other levels of conflict troughs and domain silos too. When one cog in one cell is struck, several other cogs in other domain silos and levels of conflict troughs come to life, fibrillate, influence their immediate space, but also perturb the universe of the holes at hand. This causes change and shifting influences in other silos and troughs. Can we say at this point in time that a maxim is thus born? That is to say, actions against cogs in one domain or one level can affect cogs up and down other domain silos and at other levels of conflict troughs. One has to anticipate reverberations, watch for them, and decisively act. If our considerations about vertical domain silos and horizontal levels of conflict troughs prove true for one side, should it not be true for the other side? Thus, while assaulting adversaries' cogs in this manner, we must anticipate his assault on our cogs using similar logic, and we must prepare for certain assault to come. Often the pieces and parts of wholes might appear disparate, but they still relate and connect. Life force, purpose, and strength of motive are often the bonding agents. The connections, though, could be latent, waiting to come into being upon notice, or whispering on just the right stimuli coming from unanticipated sensitive variables. Each system we seek is important to the adversary in his desire to invoke his will on us or our friends. The system we seek is a whole unto itself that connects with other wholes. But as we have talked before, they are broken into pieces, scattered, and thus protected because its wholeness is abstract and hidden. Scrape away the seeming disparateness, knowing that you will find the connections or links connecting the parts and pieces of the whole that tie to lower echelons and to our higher echelon. Please recall that bouts of will always involve pressure points, decisive points, and cogs. These three elements of conflict connect for each side. The contestants connect when they compete or prepare to compete in contests of will. Adversaries disperse their pressure points, decisive points, and centers of gravity and spread them throughout the matrix, but they still connect among themselves and with higher beings or organizations. They connect in all of these ways via the 5 kinds of links I previously discussed. These links are sometimes active and sometimes dormant. Consider this question: what value does a pressure point have in a ground vertical domain silos intersection with a strategic policy horizontal level of conflict trough? The answer is that this high level of intersection, a pressure point, is undoubtedly of no consequence, while at the tactical horizontal level of conflict intersection, With the ground vertical domain silo, it could be a center of gravity. Examples include mobile surface-to-surface missiles, or SSM, mobile surface-to-air missiles, SAM, and Koksan guns in Korea, command and control distributed elements, and so on. As systems such as the mobile SAM become more complicated, they leave trails such as pheromones when they move. For example, a SAM needs data. This need proves to be specialized, and the data comes from a variety of sources. As one source, data flows from the operational context. As another, data comes from weather radar. Also, targeting data comes from drones. Intelligence collection systems search for, find, and report on causes connecting with effects via links. Human collection data about the location and context surrounding the targets could be received. The missile system needs deceptive data to help confuse the opposition trying to find them via data trails. The SSM needs security, and security has to talk among themselves to higher headquarters and to missile crews and their leaders. The SSM needs maintenance. Thus, there is a maintenance footprint and trail via vehicles, helicopters, people, and the flow of parts. The SSM crews need human support, such as food, water, medical support, training, and they will need to contact relatives at some point in time. The SSM needs to communicate. It communicates to spotters, to sub-elements, to security, to maintenance by radio and by internet. Both leave traces that can be discovered. The missile systems and crews need to train, and I suspect they do so deep in the night in unforgiving terrain. These machines, maintainers, missile crews, logistics people and their equipment, and security people will need to move, train, sleep, go to the bathroom, eat, receive medical support, communicate, and so on. All are part of their whole. They scatter for safety and alert and come together to fire. Thus, their whole is never static and ebbs and flows, with parts and pieces residing in many different cells, sometimes neighbors to other parts of other wholes, such as artillery systems or maneuver forces. SSM could very well hide in a cave in a reserve battalion's area of operation. If so, this SSM is not a tool for the battalion commander. He is at the bottom of the vertical domain silo and intersects with the horizontal level of conflict draw 4. He has to put up with security coming with the SSM, its logistics, its maintenance, its flow of technical experts coming and going, medical support, communications, training, preeminent ground to hide on, and routes of movement, but it is little concern to him as a weapon system. But for the country's strategic policy leadership and strategic military leadership, this missile is a center of gravity, and the location of its main parts and pieces would be one or more decisive point. It connects to a center of gravity, the command and control and decision-making center, at the intersection of the ground, air, and space vertical domain silos with the strategic military horizontal levels of conflict trough, level 2. Each has the potential to cause strategic outcomes, even though the gun itself lives in the ground vertical domain silo at the tactical level of conflict trough. Let's take a quick excursion and talk about North Korea's Koksan guns along the DMZ and within range of Seoul. These guns are in caves or adits, according to Wikipedia, existing in hardened artillery sites are commonly known as hearts. To fire, they must come out of their protected area, set the range, level the weapon, load, fire, and very quickly pull the gun back into the cave or adit. These guns need ammunition vehicles to be nearby to provide the shells, if not somewhere hooked to the gun itself as it comes from the hearts, or possibly even the shells could be stashed and protected nearby the firing sites. To be proficient, one would have to practice taking out the gun, leveling the gun, setting the range, firing, and moving quickly back to the cave. If the gun breaks down, maintenance people must be on standby to repair. Undoubtedly, U.S. and rock artillery and air power will strike the gun's heart's entrances or adits. Let us assume that one entrance is bombed shut. Once the entrance is blocked, there will be machines auguring from the inside the cave toward the outward, and from the outside cave to unblock the cave. I ask that you keep in mind that each element listed above has security, maintenance, communications, automation, logistics, transportation, and peculiarities inherent to tactical level problem sets for example, augers inherent to the 170 millimeter Coxswain guns in their hardened artillery sights in North Korea. According to Wikipedia, North Korea has approximately 500 of these guns. These parts and pieces that are maintenance and logistics must come and go and appear only to disappear. But they prove difficult to notice and to recognize as they appear as scattered up and down vertical domain silos and across various horizontal levels of conflict troughs. But changes in functions, forms, objects, and connectedness and periodic appearance have to occur. And if one is looking for the right observables, they should prove real and noticeable. If one knows what to look for, when to look, and to be prepared for the interaction of opposites, appearing as objects and no objects, people and no people, and figures and no figures, and appearances and no appearances, on and off, in and out, silence and noise, peculiar and normal phenomena, then these holes of the Coxswain gun can be found and had. Obviously, if the auger is augering from the inside out, or if the workers are using picks and shovels to excavate the cave or at it, then they have to be neutralized. The gun itself is ineffective until brought outside the cave or at it so it could fire. So the augering equipment and anybody trying to tunnel in to break open the entrance to the hearts would be decisive points from the perspective of the people inside the mountain. But this equipment and people would be insignificant to North Korea's senior leadership. If 500 of the guns in the hearts were so neutralized, the additive influence of the adversaries' minds and psyches would affect national decision-making. They would have found themselves in a corresponding state of insufficient firepower to fire on Seoul. This loss would weigh heavily in the minds of North Korea's leaders up and down the ground vertical domain silo, forming the matrix cell by its intersection with tactical, operational, and strategic military horizontal levels of conflict troughs. We now understand connectedness to a sufficient level of comprehension. But to be sure of our intellectual prowess, consider connectedness in the matrix. Think about another turn of the screw of hard metal work. If we were to reduce problems and kill surface-to-surface missile tails without its many other distributed parts and pieces, such as backup missiles, backup computers, extra communication systems, more security, backup maintenance, and additional transportation in the straits of literally hundreds of breathing human beings hiding in many matrix cells up, down, and across the matrix, then trouble can quickly come henceforth. We would have failed to understand how the problem set is scaled and scattered among the cells of matrix war. If we blast the opening of a Coxswain gun without considering the augering equipment and its crew, augering equipment maintenance, transformation of equipment from stationary to moving and functioning, refueling, maintenance of old equipment, people needs and activities, see culture, for example, maintenance of computers, security, deception, etc., that is part of the holistic view, then be forewarned, blocking either adit or hearts or tunnel entrances, even with blast doors, will be temporary at best. So look at the gold dashed line that moves about as a snake in the matrix. Our minds have to think as the snake moves through the matrix and connects activities and parts and pieces of whatever whole we have decomposed that is appearing and happening in different but related horizontal and vertical mergers. To be effective and to win bouts of will, one has to think and reach a state of holistic thinking. With this kind of thinking, we could kill the parts and pieces of each cog incrementally, knowing we would get to each element incrementally, or we would just seek what we think to be the imminent cog. Or we could find and kill all of the pieces at the same time to create the maximum physical and moral domain outcomes we seek. Know that it would be optimum to kill all at one time when the snake connects to the centers of gravity identified by each starburst individual or totally, all at the same time. Since we have to admit to several centers of gravity, know that we would have to use several matrices at once, and that I'm showing you only one and a simple matrix at that. But I constructed it to help us think and understand what I'm talking about. To reach a sufficiently high state of holism, we have to use analysis, synthesis, integration, coalescence, metacognition, and relationships to not only see vestiges or apparitions of what is to come or what has been, but also to glimpse the whole via connectedness. To my way of thinking, it follows that one has to think and plan holistically, so as to synchronize our efforts to attack all of the main parts, for example, decisive points of the snake's body. With such thinking, one can thereby assault both physical and moral domains. The assault would be destroying the physical being and its strewn parts, pieces, structures, and objects. The assault on the moral domain would be via reducing his capability, thereby weakening the adversary's purpose, strength of motives, capabilities, determination, passion, and willingness to sacrifice. This thinking is fundamental to attacking the adversary's will through thoughtful actions, aiming at his 14-element thought model that connects throughout this presentation and throughout the book. Slide 27, what can be done? To close, I present what I think readers should do since you have worked your mind and spent the time to go through this discussion so far. People responsible for winning in conflicts of will must read and understand this book of will. There is no other book like this book. You can readily conclude that understanding the book and helping people learn how to think sufficiently well, not only to understand this book, but to put it into practice, takes momentous amounts of intellectual power and motivation. Such study and comprehending the inferences cascading forth as one reads this tome can only be described as complicated and challenging. The book is dense, full of ideas, models, tables, big ideas, and implications. It causes us to think. It presents models to help with thinking, and it has ideas on how to turn theory into practice. The methods I am providing to you come from 49 years of experience. This confession of difficulty to unlock the secrets in this book means that people reading it have to be committed so as to gain advantages over any adversary imbued with the power of winning, not losing, nor fighting, nor competing to a draw. I'm talking about being committed to take the time and expend the mental energy to think deeply and critically about difficult problems or challenges. I'm talking about learning how to think critically and the honing of your ability to use analysis and synthesis in an inseparable whole, as I portray as an absolute for such serious study. Such effort is imperative for unlocking the book's many secrets. In short, you have to engage in deep thinking to understand this book. It is your responsibility as a thought leader to help your people learn how to think via synthesis and holism, how to think critically, how to read critically, how to develop good conclusions, and how to make viable recommendations in situations of extremis and associated stress, as well as in daily work. You now have a system of thought for doing all of the above with this great and powerful subject of will. How to think and enact the thought about will lives between the covers of this book. It is your responsibility to read, study, understand, and put the ideas in this book into practice. You have the responsibility to purposefully help your people prepare for wars of wits and mental combat and imbue them with a desire to win in any conflict or competition. You have the responsibility to attack the adversary's will while protecting yours, just as you would prepare physical entities such as robots, tanks, planes, artillery, and so forth for conflict. Now, just a few more closing thoughts to help you plan for and execute mental combat in wars of wits. Slide 28, thinking requirements necessary to think successfully about will. To perform the intellectual challenges the book presents and to put the concepts and theories into practice, people must learn how to think. This is a broad task, and I even have a 20-page paper devoted to explaining what how to think means and how employing its challenges can open the door to power. But right now our task is to know some of the intellectual requirements so you can optimize your thinking to be capable opponents in contests of mental combat, wars of wits, and contests of clashing wills. I will be brief, but I do want you to think about the 15 ways to be able to think sufficiently well to read and understand the power of will in international conflict. So here we go. 1. Synthesis. Human cognitive activity that combines elements of context, substances, events, electrons, activities, energy, and the like to create a new, coherent, and better whole. 2. Holism. Theory that the parts of any whole cannot exist nor be understood except in relation to an extant whole or wholes coming into existence via aggregate and aggregation theory. The concept espouses the notion that wholes can be greater than the sum of its parts. 3. Imagination, drifting in and out of consciousness via contemplation, but being sufficiently conscious to see, hear, touch, smell floating shards, flotsam of data, pictures of activities, the absence of which should be present, and the all-important intrusion of one's quietude and contemplations by active and non-active appearances and presences that stimulate one's imagination. 4. Integration, a form of combination. Integration combines associated parts, pieces, people, organizations, actions, methods, processes into at least a semblance of a unified whole, and even opposites such as horizontal and vertical thinking processes, knowing full well that the whole being integrated relies on its antipode, disintegrating that which has been integrated. 5. Combinatorial, derivative of connect and connectedness as people, organizations, countries, etc. Merged into wholes, one hopes to be viable and operable. When I speak of connectedness, know I'm also including people, organizations, objects, subsystems, microaggregations, macroaggregations comprising wholes, and many other organisms and entities. 6. Analysis, breaking a whole entity into its constituent elements and thereby setting conditions for gaining understanding or meaning of each element, setting the stage for a key process in mental combat and wars of wits, that is, turning data into information. 7. Synchronization, bringing forth and releasing time pulses of energy that connect and subsequently wreak havoc by connected wallop of multiple kinds of force unleashed at the right time, right place, imbued with harmonized action, purpose, strength of motive, and capability. 8. Anomaly, different, aberrant, change from normal. 9. Tendency, inclination toward a certain action, behavior, but sometimes an action coming into being. 10. Anticipation, pre-knowledge or foreknowledge of something going to happen. Prescience owing to vestiges or traces of cause leading to effect, connected by 5 kinds of links: social, human, technical, functional, organizational, and thought. 11. Integration, integrates and combines like and dissimilar people, organizations, objects, systems, and subsystems. 4 important aspects of integrative thinking include horizontal thinking, in which thought can traverse across boundaries, stovepipes, domains, and levels of conflict. Horizontal thinking improves relationships and combinations. To perform horizontal thinking, people's minds must involve synthesis, where elements, parts, pieces, thoughts, concepts become another and better whole being or object. Another important aspect is vertical thinking. This involves people using rigorous analysis and to deep dive and thoroughly know a subject or thought well, but in relationship to the whole in which it resides. 12. Aggregation, gathering and bonding separate aggregates into a larger whole. This whole is collective and responsive to accepting like and disparate entities into its former boundaries. 13. Coalescence is a conjoining of elements, people, machines, and so forth into a whole, which is sometimes viable and sometimes an abomination. This is a powerful word, as it helps people and their minds comprehend how to think about evocative but functional words like unifying groups of people and their organizations, fusing differences, and consolidating positions. 14. Relationships, connections, links, strands between and among people, people-populated organizations, families, connections, countries, man and context, complex adaptive systems, and so forth. Relationships serve to foster purpose, meaning, outcomes, ends, ways, and means. Relationships are at the center of all business, diplomacy, economies, and so forth. 15. Connectedness, people, organizations, countries, etc., merged into wholes one hopes to be viable and operable. When I speak of connectedness, know I'm also including people, organizations, objects, subsystems, microaggregations, macroaggregations comprising wholes, and many other organisms and entities. Slide 29, Integrative Thinking. Here you see a thought model that is in my book about will. Most people are good at analysis, which finds a thinker decomposing the subject at hand and relishing mental work in and vertical thinking, as you see in the model. With analysis, people break apart ideas, concepts, goals, objectives, capabilities, and study each, all necessary, beyond doubt. But they easily fall into the trap of reductionism or falling in love with their knowledge of one or more particular parts or aspects of a whole without knowing and comprehending the whole itself. I'm sure you can see that when people are reductionists with their intellects, severe limits arise. As such, these people sometimes become stuck in vertical thinking, as it were, endlessly mucking about in the bottom of a vertical domain silo. It is unusual to find the vertical thinker who can synthesize and integrate what they and other people have been thinking about. Horizontal thinking still requires deep diving into the vertical domain silos where one can, or better said, must perform detailed analytic thinking. But they take what they learn in one silo and combine it with what they learn in other silos. They take the new synthesized whole and combine it with one or more horizontal levels of conflict troughs. The need is not only to master the deep thinking silo, but to synthesize and integrate all vertical silos into a whole via horizontal thinking. And one must master potential, such as the outcomes of conflict and how this outcome affects other silos at other levels of conflict. We must realize how each of the stovepipes in the deep dive thinking connect with and influence the elements in horizontal thinking. For example, air, ground, sea, space, cyber, information, and cognition, depending on the context and situation at hand. Without true integrative thinking, one cannot beat a sophisticated adversary who comes at us across and within all 7 domains of conflict and up and down all 4 levels of conflict. Integration is a form of combination. Integration combines associated parts, pieces, people, organizations, actions, methods, processes into at least a semblance of a unified whole, and even opposites such as horizontal and vertical thinking processes. The whole being integrated relies on its antipode, disintegrating, which that has been integrated. Holism and synthesis are the absolutes to be capable of integrative thinking. To effectively use one's comprehension of will, they must master and employ vertical, horizontal, synthetic, holistic, and integrative thinking. This mental competence enables people to work comfortably in matrix war. They successfully compete in multi-conflict vertical domain silos and at several horizontal levels of conflict troughs, present and influential for the outcomes of any conflict. Slide 30, appearances and strengths relative to will. In our understanding of will and how to think about it, let us take our contemplation further and move to other elements of will such as determination, perseverance, advantage, disadvantage, passion, and sacrifice. Given that we know from reading the book what each means, question 1 arises. How can we affect and turn into vulnerabilities these abstract yet concrete elements of our 14-element model of will? We know our opponent plans to deny our entreaties, and he will bring his energies to bear to win in this war of wits and mental combat. Question 2 is how can we anticipate and protect our strengths from the adversary's attacks or manipulations by using appearances? So, how do we think about this difficult and admittedly obscure but still worthy subject? Of course, we have talked about wargaming as wargaming, being in his mind's eye, being in his skin, and perceiving as he perceives. We have also spoken about our wargaming and using a culturally adept person to be our enemy. We have also talked about using a red team to attack our thinking and to attack and challenge our assumptions. I want this red team to pick out my errors in logic and bias and help me to regain the right path of thinking, or if I cannot, then the red team can correct these errors. With all of this said, think about appearances and strengths and let us delve into them for a peek into their essences. I start with answering this hypothetical. What is an appearance? I use this definition. An appearance is the manifestation of an altered state of being materialized in my mind. An appearance has numerous states of manifestation, such as physicality, presence, color, size, depth, width, height, sound, dress, nonverbal behavior, action, cause to effect, outcomes, visions, links, patterns, anomalies, aggregations, and so on. An appearance signifies disturbance and a change in energy in a particular operational context and within the activities ongoing therein. Something causes an appearance to manifest sufficiently well to cause us to recognize it as a legitimate presence. Thus, there is a cause linking to the effect, with the effect being an appearance. We must understand cause, link, effect relationships before we can work with appearances and thus gain advantages in the struggle for ascendancy of wills. One can thus surmise the presence of people-caused appearances. We can anticipate such appearances and at least become more intellectually and organizationally nimble. In addition, one finds appearances coming from within the operational context, for example, a rainstorm or a sandstorm or fog. These appearances, though, can advent via natural, contextual, or human-induced data. The contextual creation and human realization of new or existing appearances can come from within our four kinds of context, or they could come from the larger whole with whom we have conjoined. Also, new or existing appearances could come from smaller contexts in which our larger context enfolded. Know, though, that in this thought, our contextual aggregation has unfolded into a larger contextual aggregation. These machinations involve aggregation and wholes that we have discussed before, where our aggregation unfolds into larger contextual aggregations, and our contextual aggregation enfolds smaller contexts into ours. Each of these appearances you see in the visual can cause perturbation in our operational context. What we want with respect to battles of will is to use appearances to wither and shaken the strengths of the adversary. We also want to create appearances that can successfully attack one or more of the adversary's 14-element will model. We also have to anticipate the adversary's attempts to attack our model of will with appearances he anticipates will shaken our resolve and weaken the strength of one or more of our 14-element thought model of will. Thus, we need to conclude that there will be a battle of appearances raging in the operational context, thus causing more turbulence and leaving vestiges of the presence of appearances. Each side in this battle is attempting to induce decay in the 14-element thought model the other side is using, and more specifically in the strength that you can see on the visual. So along with physical attributes of will's model, for the most part, the deep thinker always finds many intangible forces at play when considering their appearances relative to will. Thus, the deep thinker must think about implications. With changing settings and passage of time, the means to gain strength can undergo decay, particularly as it expends energy. The other implication involves the potential decay of appearances prevalent with both sides that could potentially affect the outcome of the game of wills. Decay, of course, is a way to influence an adversary's strength of inclination to sacrifice, to accomplish goals and objectives, and to use capabilities to satisfy his aim, goals, objectives, strategies, and so forth. Thus, we must know the adversary's strengths from two realities, ours and from the adversary's perspectives. Thus, we can intelligently attempt to induce decay and thus dissipate the power of his strengths. Ideally, we wish to induce decay into that which matters to the opponent without him being aware of our manipulations. I am convinced, though, that if one can find their adversary's strengths from his perspectives, of course, then one can vigorously pursue decay. Also of interest to deep-thinking people, one realizes that what appears in reality and in the adversary's mind as strength can be susceptible to induced decay. Examples of strengths that have to exist before decay comes include those I list on the visual. Note, too, that some of the elements of will often seem to be impenetrable to decay, such as life force, purpose, strength of motive, and capabilities. Seeming to be impenetrable to either manipulation or direct assault, though, should not alter our course of action we designed to assault these elements of will. Assaulting the adversary's essential elements of will by inducing decay is a good strategy. Of course, the strategy won't always work, but your co-evolutionary system will provide you with the knowledge to recognize and adapt better and faster than your adversary. Thus, you will be nimble in mind and in organization and proceed with finding his weaknesses and using them to assault his strengths. Slide 31, what needs to be done? As a thought leader, you are responsible for helping your people learn how to think sufficiently well to read and understand this book of will. Thus, I challenge leaders to read and comprehend this book, develop learning programs that will help their people read, understand, and implement the ideas in the book relative to their many operational contexts. Develop deep thinking people whom I call uber thinkers and thought pilgrims. Bring forth mental proficiency in analysis, synthesis, and holism. Implementing the book demands comprehending the book, nimbleness of thought to action, and an eye for important but fleeting pressure points, decisive points, and centers of gravity at work in the 28-cell matrix I introduced in this book. I provide you with models to help you understand and implement the ideas in the book. The 14-element model of will is most important. For purpose of review, here are the model's 14 elements. 1 is life force, 2, purpose, 3, capabilities, 4, strength of motive, 5, perseverance, 6, determination, 7, advantage, 8, disadvantage, 9, passion, 10, sacrifice, 11, impose, 12, act, 13, assess, and 14, adapt. As we progressed on our journey, we talked about wargaming the adversary's wargaming. Also, we talked about a tool for wargaming the adversary's wargaming involving the dictum, ride the wild pendulum. This dictum, in turn, is buttressed by an idea from Clausewitz, which is duality. The notion of duality provides the reader with a vivid and historical connection reaching out to my mind from On War. Then we talked extensively about coevolution and adaptation. They proved to be of great importance in winning struggles for dominance of will. Next, all people preparing for or actually in conflict have to think deeply about the 18 considerations of will that I introduce and explain in the book. Also of importance, we found and talked about characteristics of nonlinearity. It is a thought model with 17 characteristics that always prove important in our thinking about will. And most complicated of all, we learned about the 28-cell model I created for use with matrix war. Slide 32, what needs to be done, continued. Some people might conclude that the subject is too difficult to learn and apply. I respectfully disagree. All of us can gain knowledge about will and with study, learn how to think to the highest standards about imposing their will and winning. But the win can only come when you successfully consider and counter an adversary's impositions or denial actions. I submit that leaders of all ranks, roles, managers, judges, lawyers, law enforcement officials, and trainers, corporate planners, corporate security, and college professors, and so forth, have to learn this book and then mentor their youth to read, know, understand, and implement some or all of the ideas in the book. After all, it does lead the reader to take many a deep think dive into this dense and complicated subject. Fortunately, my book has a solid foundation that comes from history, philosophy, theory, and original thinking. It provides thought models, visuals, and I use literary techniques to help readers understand will's intricacies. Sufficiency of comprehension is an issue. My position is that sufficiency of comprehension of the book is reached when the reader puts the ideas, theory, and concepts into practice. Reading this book and understanding it behooves you to not only help others learn will's general theory, but to include its intricacies. All people will benefit from taking this intellectual journey as you walk with me up the trail to the light of knowledge. Along the way, I know that you will be thinking about will, talking with me about the subject, and because of its density and complexity, you will feel an urge to halt, to take a time out, close your eyes, and travel to your high country and inner sanctum to think about will and its implications for you in your particular context. When we reach the light of knowledge, know that comprehension is yours, and that you have found a certain nirvana of knowledge that stirs with new ideas between the book covers of The Power of Will in International Conflict. As a final review of what I want readers to do, I ask you to, first, be certain that you have read every word and studied what you have input into your mind. Second, help other people learn how to think about will. Third, put what you learn into practice. Fourth, engage in deep think about technical and organizational implications so as to have the machines and organizations to support and optimize this way of thinking. Fifth, improve upon my work and uncover even more powerful characteristics of this great phenomenon. Know that I'm hanging this briefing on YouTube and the script to my website at waynemhall.com. Then click on Contact Us, then click on Blog, and there you can find both briefing and a script for each slide. The briefing has a small speaker at the lower right-hand corner that provides an explanation of each visual with the tutelage of my thoughts. Some, by the way, are not in the book. Thus, I'm hoping you will be at ease presenting all or parts of this briefing and using the script to explain and create interest in reading the book. You can contact me at hallwm@me.com. Thank you. fundamental thought in any serious thinking about will involves the notion of connectedness. It means joined into a viable and thereby operable whole. In simpler words, I'm talking about entities or thoughts linked one to the other in purposeful agreement. Know well this phenomenon, that is to say, parts, pieces, people, organizations, machines, infrastructures, and so forth, linked with one another to set the stage for coherency of a whole. 5 kinds of links exist and prove essential for connectedness in our thinking. They are cultural, functional, technical, thought, and human social links. The links serve as binding agents in our whole. The parts, pieces, organizations, people, and machines, etc., each a small whole in their own right, also exist as in situ assemblages, thus proving to be important elements of the larger whole of which we speak. If our whole of which we speak is filled with sufficient energy, purpose, and strength of motive, then when assembled, the parts, people, organizations, and machines can live in and even govern the whole of connections and thrive. When this whole emerges, with time and place and intent, the process, understood and guided with high level and high quality thinking, achieves a state of coherence which empowers one or both sides in any struggle of will. Coherence is a sought-after state of being as it signifies high quality. Reaching a state of coherence allows the whole in question to function optimally. Coherence allows a smoothness in function among the parts and pieces of the whole. Coherence imbues the whole's total capabilities to come forth in a synchronized way to inflict maximum force on an adversary's resistance. Coherence sets the conditions for synergy among parts, pieces, objects, subsystems, microaggregations, macroaggregations that comprise a high-quality, relevant whole. It is the coherent whole in which one side or the other effectively uses to accomplish their aims, goals, and objectives to successfully impose their will on an enemy or to deny his impositions. Okay, all should be well in our minds. So let's take a deeper dive and dial up some cognitive dissonance. Here we go. The 7 vertical domain silos of conflict connect, 1, among themselves vertically, and 2, with the 4 strata of the horizontal level of conflict troughs. Connectedness first occurs in one's mind as the mind visualizes what could be by way of connections. I'm speaking, of course, about connections within the matrix cells and the actions that create outcomes. I'm also speaking about connectedness of causes leading to effects. Pushing ahead even further, I'm speaking about the links connecting causes to effects. Knowing this kind of connectedness is the key to preemption and struggles for initiative and even larger struggles for dominance of wills. If something happens in an intersection in the matrix, as opposed to the centrality of a cell, one finds it also occurs as a ripple effect among different horizontal levels of conflict troughs and vertical domain silos. When an event at the tactical level of conflict trough occurs in a particular vertical domain silo in which it resides, then the released energy can affect what happens at the strategic level policy in the same vertical domain silo and other vertical domain silos to which the first silo connects. Thus, one can imagine windless rainfall-like actions occurring within vertical domain silos. Then, a snake-like curvature appears. It is the connection of influence. This phenomenon is real but proves difficult to follow and to grasp as appearance. Nonetheless, the slithering head leads to forms, which come forth in causes and effects in other cells, coming forth from the union of vertical domain silos and other horizontal levels of conflict troughs. Imagine the snake-like curvature to be a curved connectedness of causes and effects. With our imagination at work, we can see the curvature and understand its relationship to causes and effects. The connectedness that comes forth startles our minds. With it, we possess holistic thinking that empowers seemingly unimportant actions to create significant outcomes of action owing to the strength and power racing about throughout cells, connections, and the whole in question. The actions stretch, reaching out by way of the snake-like curvature, and move across several vertical domain silos and rupture the membranes encasing horizontal levels of conflict troughs. To perform this mental function of connecting like and disparate-like things, one thinks integratively. As one thinks integratively, they enter vertical domain silos to understand the parts and pieces of each of the elements within the silo that reside with the potential to act either sequentially or simultaneously. As a spider and gossamer gazes on their web, they imagine appearances showing horizontal and vertical connections down, across, up, and down in the matrix. The connections occur when one mentally knits the parts and pieces of disassembled elements into wholes, which then connect to other like and dissimilar wholes. When mentally knitting, one can cross the horizontal and vertical lines comprising one or more cells in the matrix. Then one knits the aggregates and forms aggregations into wholes, the nascent whole integrates into macro wholes. These macro wholes originate as singular, then aggregated cells of horizontal and vertical intersections. With this understanding of the probability of connectedness, one can understand the power of which I speak that resides in the matrix war concept. Complicated, yes. Yet the thinking is rudimentary for fighting and winning in wars of wits and mental combat in purposeful multi-domain struggles over will. This kind of struggle occurs now, and it's only going to intensify. Thus, I know you can see the complexity of matrix war. This complexity, the coming multi-domain conflicts, the speed of actions occurring in vertical domain silos, the effect of actions moving up and down through and in horizontal levels of conflict troughs, suggests the need to have incredible holistic thinking and it to merger with synthetic contexts, specifically programmed avatars, powerful linked computers, virtual knowledge environments, and knowledge centers. To top off all of this, we have to understand the theoretical connected relationship between our thinking and actions and Clausewitz's admonition, which is the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish by that test the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. This is the first of all strategic of questions and the most comprehensive. Clausewitz on War, pages 88 through 89. The various tools available in multi-domain conflicts suggest the importance of artificial intelligence and advanced hardware-software avatars our engineers can build. These artificial intelligence-empowered avatars come to life driving and supporting command and control, wargaming the adversary's wargaming, anticipating his cause to effect to link actions, giving our leaders the opportunity to preempt, and for sagely attacking or manipulating the adversary's coevolution, adaptation, and recursion cycles. This is not to say deep thinking is archaic, nor is it saying that the human being in conflict will be forced to make decisions with data instead of knowledge. But I do say that our minds must learn how to think deeply and quickly to understand the phenomena of matrix war with its connecting arteries running throughout a conflict, its start, its action, its operational context, and its successful conclusion. I do say that we have to understand how, in a complex operational context that surrounds and permeates the 28 cells of matrix war, we find, if we look, a force, an apparition, a spread in energy, connecting like and unlike activities and events, parts and pieces, people and their organizations, missiles, cyber attacks, artillery fire, tanks and armored personnel carriers, command and control apparatuses, cruise missiles, drones, weapons of mass destruction, IEDs, ambushes with machine guns and rifles, kidnapping, assassinations, terrorism, propaganda, social network websites, and attacks via narratives, and the like. These parts and pieces, happenings, people, organizations, weapons, communications, etc., may seem disparate and inconsequential, but know well that in my mind, all connect. All the pieces matter, and they connect in matrix war. So our minds and organizations and machines must prepare for this kind of conflict when our country needs to impose its will on multi-domain oriented adversaries, and know we must learn to resist multi-domain attacks by a determined adversary. To this end, we must start with my notion of matrix war. What you see here is the matrix, the 7 vertical domain silo schema to understand battles over will: air, ground, sea, space, cyber, information, and cognition. Information's importance is obvious owing to its relationship to quest for meaning and knowledge to foster good decision-making. Also, information is imperative for psychological operations and deception in the social media age. Information comes from data that comes from context. or that one gathers via its intelligence collection systems. Information can become knowledge via the higher level cognition that is synthesis. This combination, data, information, and knowledge, and how they affect decisions, actions, assessing actions, and adaptation, proves critical to winning in any contests of will. Thus, its gathering, validating, and use can lead to information superiority and information dominance. Quality, though, becomes important to winning in this fight for superiority and dominance. Thus, this process must lead to better and faster decision making in acting, assessing, and adapting than the adversaries. It follows that information has to be a full-scale domain as it is critical to winning contests of will. Closely related, though, one finds cognition, which is perhaps a bit more obscure than information. Cognition means, according to the Oxford University Press, the mental function or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. In our thinking about reaching a high state of cognition, our people must engage in higher level thought with synthesis, holism, relational thinking, integrative thinking, fragmentation, connectedness, and coalescence. Cognition is the key in winning the distinctive kind of struggle for ascendancy of will. It is through cognition that we make decisions. Because of the importance of decisions and how thinking affects the quality of decisions, we shall be involved in battles over the quality of thinking. Thus, I can say without equivocation that we find ourselves, right now, in mental combat and wars of wits. This fact helps us realize that we can think about and recognize mental combat and larger wars of wits as the new normal. This new normal in which we find ourselves is inherent to struggles over cognition. It follows that America has to outthink its opponents in bouts of mental combat and wars of wits. This situation prevails not just at the present, but it's going to intensify over the next century. This view proves to be fact and truth, particularly when one understands the intensity of struggles for ascendancy of will as America works against Russia, China, drug people, terrorists, and other asymmetric foes. The implication is quite simple. That is, because of the importance of decisions, how one thinks and reaches decisions becomes fair game in contests of will. This means that we have to help our people learn how to think by way of the highest levels of cognition, by education, organizational learning, mentorship, and self-directed learning throughout life. As a new thought, we have to treat cognition as a weapon system, same with information. Many of our best people will be in mental combat all the time across the 28 cells and with all instruments of national policy. Some of our people are, in fact, orchestrating a larger war of wits in which mental combat is a sub-element of the larger whole of continuous struggle and competition. China and Russia, proven masters at melding information and cognition into their national aims, goals, objectives, and strategies, know the importance of cognition and information. They seek to be superior in thinking and in manipulating information to all takers in struggles of will with the objective of causing opponents to acquiesce and capitulate. These battles in mental combat and wars of wits epitomize struggles for superiority of will that I believe shall play well over the next 100 years. Our foes' asymmetric approaches involve information via disinformation, deception, cyber operations, information operations, and seeking and gaining information superiority. Also, cognition or thinking and metacognition proved to be directly linked to maskirovka, loosely defined as deception. But it proves to be closer to information operations, which the Russians proved so adept. In other words, the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and drug cartels are exceptionally practiced in deception and manipulation of thoughts, perceptions, and even emotions. The elevated importance of social media as it impacts people's minds and fills these minds with data and information around the world has heightened the importance of both information and cognition. Action is occurring even now, as we speak, in the matrix, where vertical domain silos and horizontal levels of conflict troughs intersect. This action creates the cells now in matrix war. As I view the matrix and gaze upon the 28 cells where the struggles of will occur, I can see how people can be confused, as the matrix appears in isolation. But in truth, one finds a high degree of relationship among the domains and levels of conflict. And upon taking another look, one finds the matrix they see, with all its relationships, to be entangled with other larger and smaller matrices. All of them either unfold into larger matrices or enfold smaller matrices, thus creating aggregations when conditions in the operational context suggest or demands congealing into the wholes of which I speak. Alas, once again, aggregation theory comes forth for recognition as a critical theory in our understanding of matrix war. Know well that lots and lots of connections exist in matrix war, and they dominate conflicts of will. Thus, we have to learn this theory of connectedness and apply it to daily struggles of will. As a next step in our journey of learning, we shall talk about connectedness in matrix war. Slide 20, imagining the mind's eye. A mind's eye is, of course, to be found in a human mind. We are speaking about a mind that is thinking about imposing his will on an opponent who possesses something he wants. Or we could be thinking about a mind that is deep in thought, discerning whether to parry or capitulate to an imposition of will. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines my mind's eye as the mental faculty of conceiving imaginary or recollected scenes. My definition of mind's eye is a place where functions relative to the dictionary definition occur. Here's the definition that I developed for my book of will. A mind's eye is an inner sanctum of thought where one imagines and visualizes a commingling of data fragments and shards streaming into the sanctum via the body's portals into the quiet inner refuge of one's private thoughts. Psychiatrist Carl Jung has another label for what I identify as the phenomenon of mind's eye. That is, in my view, he uses the word psyche to describe the mind's eye like I use in my book. All thinking people recognize they have a psyche, and other people, of course, have psyches. I dare say that they recognize that we live with consciousness, where we think, plan, decide, and unconsciousness that is unknowable. We go into the well of unconscious only in our dreams, and during strange instances all of us have experienced in being alive, and other times deja vu, flashbacks, and visions of what could be in the future. We walk on higher ground when we realize and admit out loud that neither the conscious nor unconscious parts of our mind can ever be completely understood. Dr. Jung's thoughts add brightness to our mind's eye, as he tells us, but the psyche creates our world, our understanding, which allows us to make only indirect and hypothetical inferences about the real nature of matter. A struggle occurs in one's psyche between real and unreal ideas and thoughts. Hence, if we speak of the totality of an experience, the word totality can refer only to the conscious part of it. The psyche is no exception to the general rule that the universe can be established only so far as our psychic organism permits. Jung, Psychological Reflections, page 7. This means to me that if we expand our intellectual horizons, we will be able to extend our view of what is possible. Jung goes on to posit, anything psychic is Janus' face. It looks both backwards and forwards. Because it is evolving, it is also preparing the future. Were this not so, intentions, aims, plans, calculations, predictions, and premonitions would be psychological impossibilities. Jung, Psychological Reflections, page 15. The mind's eye is indeed difficult to describe, as it is a human being's inner sanctum, deep within a mind where a host of intellectual functions occur. Carl Jung helps us a little with this thought. I know, however, from hundredfold experience that it contains the equivalents of everything that has been formulated in dogma and a good deal more, which is just what enables it to be an eye destined to behold the light. This requires limitless range and unfathomable depth of vision. Jung, Psychological Reflections, page 20. I believe, broadly speaking, that the mind's eye is where, at a minimum, some intellectual functions occur, such as analysis, synthesis, combination, fragmentation, coalescence, relationships, integration, synchronization, and the place where an apparition of holism first casts its welcome shadow. To reach this higher level of thinking, one can pay a price, so Carl Jung tells us, about the light of knowledge and its enabling function for broadening and deepening one's mind. The brighter it becomes via deep thinking and knowledge, the more agitated the unconscious becomes and the wilder the dreams that come forth therein. Jung, Psychological Reflections, page 25. One's mind eye, or as Jung calls our psyche, is a place where the thinker works with aggregation and wholes. Thus our person becomes aware of a propensity at play, requiring a watchful eye for the appearance of conditions in which variables become not only sensitive but highly influential. They watch for and recognize when sensitive dependence on initial conditions becomes prevalent. They watch for and shape the conditions when small inputs start causing the formation of large, unexpected outputs, such as aggregates becoming large aggregations. It is where the birth of causality occurs as causes to links to effects appear, first as a vision, then as real action. It is there in the mind's eye where this sought-after presence of holism first lights up the probabilities for achieving synergy. These prospects lurk in the operational context and often take only with the embracing of a sensitive variable to come forth into actuality and influencing contests of wills. With synergy, one finds a variant of holism, and in so doing, discover the phenomenon of wholes being greater than the simple sum of their parts. One of the implications that come to mind is that leaders and decision makers should recognize and employ the mental power of their best thinkers' minds' eyes to perform the deep and arduous thinking. Also, this implication suggests that mental combat involves a battle between contestants' mind's eyes. As I consider the mind's eye, I notice its brightness and its functioning. The brightness ebbs and flows, but continually becomes brighter and brighter with study, deep thought, expression, and understanding of reflection. Interestingly, Jung tells us that as an event occurs in what I call an operational context, it occurs again in our minds if we are conscious of the event. Jung, Psychological Reflections, page 22. Along the line of the notion of a human being's mind's eye, Clausewitz tells us of what he calls the inward eye. He says the inward eye, stripped of metaphor and of the restrictions imposed upon it, merely refers to a quick recognition of a truth that the mind would ordinarily miss or would perceive only after long study and reflection. Clausewitz on War, page 102. Clausewitz also tells us of the inward eye of a relationship relative to my book's discussion of determination and perseverance as essential elements of the 14-element thought model I present in The Power of Will. As such, Clausewitz tells us, their courage and their intellect work are separate, not together. Determination, therefore, does not result. It is engendered only by a mental act. The mind tells man that boldness is required and thus gives direction to his will. Clausewitz on War, page 103. His thoughts help to reinforce a connectedness between On War and The Power of Will, with this thought that men cannot possess determination in the sense in which we use the word. They may act without hesitation in a crisis, but if they do, they act without reflection. And a man who acts without reflection cannot, of course, be torn by doubt. Clausewitz on War, page 103. Clausewitz's inward eye deals with the presence and means to reason and always seeks a balance of mind. Even under the most difficult situation, the mind can't succumb to fear of failing or the emotion of physical fear. Instead, he tells us that the intellect must play a great role in war, the dominant domain of the unexpected, since it is nothing but an increased capacity of dealing with the unexpected. Clausewitz on War, page 103. Something else occurs in the mind's eye. It is perception, which is, of course, a derivative of perceive. To perceive means to become aware of, know, or identify by means of the senses. It is perception that directly affects how people think, plan, and interpret. To perceive is the start of a thought process that this book presents and uses in hypothetical planning, wargaming, and advanced analysis sessions. Perception is how one's life force first becomes alert to a desire arising within one's mind. Perception is how a person first becomes aware of the potential of resistance to his desire and what outcomes could come forth from clashes of wills. As a perception departs, it leaves traces that prove to be vestiges. The deep thinker scrapes these traces and synthesizes them back into wholes. With the wholes, the mind's eye turns that which one perceives into concepts, ideas, cost-benefit analyses, thinking, and so forth, as I listed earlier. Just keep in mind that perception isn't thinking, but it is the start of a thinking process. It is where one's imagination comes forth to influence the thought functions I listed before. Remember, your adversary is also going through this same intellectual drill. Borrowing from Sun Tzu, who tells us to attack the enemy's plans at their inception, interpolation tells me when it would be wise to start attacking or at least influencing my adversary. My thinking tells me that any action must be very subtle at first. Then I hear my readers and listeners ask a good question. They ask, why? I have an answer. That is, an appearance of perceptions appears in my mind's eye. Such appearances suggest the presence of one or more cause and effect relationships. Change it is that actuates my sensory apparatuses. I notice signs of change through slight movements, subtle actions, nuanced shifts in verbiage, variations in what are repetitive or normal patterns, or better yet, the slowing or speeding up of the activity involved with standing patterns. The thought here is to imagine what his perceptions could be. I also capture in my mind's eye a visual that shows a nexus connecting perception, desire, life force, and resolve. I then set my coevolution system to work against my opponent without any cyber attacks. While realizing this heightened watchfulness disturbs the universe, I attempt to hide the cause via social media, exercises, or training. Instead, I gain influence with my intelligence collections tasking, driven by advanced analysis observables. I'm specifically looking for data showing a blip indicating shifts in normalcy and indicating unexplained change in my adversary's activities, perceptions, desires, life force, and resolve. Can this be done? The answer is yes, by all means. We have to pursue such thoughts to control the initiative and the 6 other advantages. Now I speak of and quote from Sun Tzu's famous aphorisms. As one relative to our case at hand, Sun Tzu tells us, to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. Thus, what is of supreme importance in war is to attack the enemy's strategy, attack plans at their inception. Sun Tzu, The Art of War, 77. With such adjurations rampaging through our thoughts, one finds, with deep thinking, some of what could happen or has happened in one's mind's eye. That is, if we listen to Sun Tzu, then we want to attack our adversary's plans at their inception. To do so, we must plot to defeat the enemy before he commences actions to impose his will. To attack an enemy's plans and his strategy at their inception takes a connected presence and influence of aggressive mindsets in a number of people. One aspect of this work is to find clues of the beginning of effects, links, and causes. Such clues could lead our minds to alert on changes in energy levels leading to subtle alterations in the potential operational context. Finding changes at inception suggests mental travail, with the thought warrior knowing full well that lots of deep thinking must occur. Out of the thinking comes actions and, in reality, a plan to successfully impose your will and thwart the will of the adversary. This plan, my objective, and associated action is to alter his thinking, his planning, and his scheming before he turns them into physical attempts to impose his will on me. Interestingly, you must realize that a perception is Clausewitz's view of imagination. As such, he tells us that things are perceived, of course, partially by the naked eye and partially by the mind, which fills the gaps with guesswork based on learning and experience, and thus constructs a whole out of fragments that the eye can see. He goes on to say that, if the whole is to be vividly present to the mind, imprinted like a picture, like a map, upon the brain, without fading or blurring in detail, it can only be achieved by the mental gift that we call imagination. Clausewitz, On War, page 109. One of the most creative functions that appears in one's mind's eye is where people first begin to recognize wholes as appearing, congealing, and connecting. People, organizations, activities, communications, data, equipment, thoughts, computing, and so forth all start together and congeal. Their purpose comes forth by the appearance of relationships, connections, and aggregations. So let's consider the wholes of which I speak. A whole is something comprehensive in itself, including all of its parts or elements. Wholes can pre-exist, such as the human body, a tree, an organization, or an airplane. Or human beings, organizations, and machines can make wholes of like or disparate elements or parts using the theory of aggregation. Wholes come together with the thinking skills of synthesis and holism. Interestingly, Clausewitz talks about the importance of wholes coming to the mind's eye via appearances when he tells us in On War, the man responsible of reevaluating the whole must bring to his task the quality of intuition that perceives the truth at every point. Otherwise, a chaos of opinions and considerations would arise and fatally entangle judgment. He goes on to tell us, What this task requires in the way of a higher intellectual gift is a sense of unity and power of judgment, raised to a marvelous pitch of vision, which easily grasps and surmises 1,000 remote possibilities which an ordinary mind would labor to identify and wear itself out in so doing. Clausewitz on War, page 112. One's mind's eye is the door to the upper mind. As I said in my book, The Power of Will in International Conflict, the upper mind is protected by the mind's eye. One's mind's eye is at work with perceptive inputs arriving and mixing with one's imagination from the undermind and rational thought from the overmind. This eye selects the data, information, and knowledge coming into the upper mind. The upper mind is where thinking occurs. The undermind takes all the remaining data, absorbs it, analyzes it, and stores data that has a chance of relevance. Author Guy Claxton explains the undermind with these passages. The undermind is a layer of activity within the human psyche that is richer and more subtler than consciousness. It can register and respond to events which, for one reason or another, do not become conscious. We have at our disposal a shimmering database full of preconceptual information, much of which is turned down by consciousness as being too contentious or unreliable. Guy Claxton, Harebrained Tortoise Mind, 116. The undermind stores some of the vast data coming into the body's portals and discards the rest into non-being. The undermind connects with the mind's eye, but the undermind is largely opaque, so they don't communicate as the mind's eye communicates with the upper mind. One's dreams come forth from the undermind and often consist of the data that the upper mind has discarded as being specious or stray. With this line of thinking, one's mind's eye must eventually reason how the adversary perceives, thinks, and plans. In addition, one has to know how his adversary views the operational context to include the advantages and disadvantages it presents to each antagonist. Here is another thinking chore. That is, you must realize that this adversary has to think about how you think he thinks about you and your view of his capabilities and the motives and purposes behind any hostile actions. This same look into how you think he thinks must involve the pluses and minuses that the operational context presents for exploitation. Our adversary also has to have a good understanding of how the adversary that appears so clearly in his mind's eye and thinks about his adversary. The mind's eye must comprehend the recipient's thinking about his desires and the awakening of his life force. Our minds must see and thoroughly understand his strength of motive coming forth in his early thoughts. The mind's eye has to work with both upper and under minds to gain understanding of this opponent. As such, we have to anticipate how he thinks and decides that which truly matters relative to his plans to attack and win, thus successfully initiating actions to impose his will on us. But of great interest, the wise leader considers how this adversary contemplates violence to successfully impose his will. Just thinking always involves an addendum and prods us to ponder how he thinks you perceive, think, plan, decide, act, assess, and so forth. Slide 18, Considerations of Will. At this point in our journey, I took a break and assessed my story. I came to the conclusion from my review and assessment that I needed to adapt. I decided to strengthen my 14-element model of will as it spirals throughout my book and this discussion. I decided to add more intellectual heft to the conceptual framework. To meet this requirement, I developed a table with 18 considerations. In my book, consideration is careful thought or extensive forethought. Thus, we now turn to a focus on the considerations of will that I use in the book. Readers can use these considerations to understand the extent of the deliberations they must make in their thinking processes. Readers are best served by pondering the processes and potential outcome of imposing their will on another party or parrying their attempt to do likewise on you. Therefore, I'll briefly discuss these considerations. Please note, though, that I present and discuss them throughout The Power of Will in International Conflict. The people most likely to use these considerations involve the people working and living with conflict. More specifically, I point to decision makers, policy makers, corporate and military planners, aides to senior commanders, military commanders, corporate leaders, corporate strategists, attorneys, judges, police, and so on. I started working on the list of considerations quite some time ago, but I was most focused on the term when I was the J2, or intelligence officer, for the U.S. forces in Korea. Thinking about how to crack the mode of protecting surrounding my adversary's will in that crucible, I found myself thinking about will every day. I was trying to anticipate if the North Koreans would be attacking the South like they did in June 1950, and if true, why would they attack and with what end state did they have in mind? If they attacked, I was worried if such an attack, specifically designed to impose their will on the Republic of Korea, was to accomplish limited objectives or to impose their will on the entirety of the Republic of Korea. I found thinking about will to be a most difficult subject. Complicating matters, I had no reference to use it as a starting point for thinking in depth about this subject. Then, in about 2005, several years after I had retired from the Army, as I was working as a consultant for the Joint Forces Command, I started to tinker with this difficult, seemingly impenetrable concept of will. It was then that I developed for the first time a partial list of considerations one should make to think about will successfully. In 2008, I was leading seminars to intelligence analysts centered on my book, Intelligence Analysis: How to Think in Complex Environments. I included will as a category in critical thinking, but I was frustrated in that there were no references for where I wanted to take the discussion of will. I became more motivated to explain will to my seminar students, but unfortunately, I had only briefly discussed it in my book about advanced intelligence analysis. But I did come up with a few more considerations of will that seemed appropriate and usable. Since then, I have been adding, subtracting, and combining considerations of will. In retrospect, I just scratched and skimmed along the edges of the notion of will, but I didn't stop, think, and go into this concept in detail. I have done so now and have picked and shoveled my way into the heart and body of will with this, my fourth and last book. Now I know that my journey into will's heart must continue until I die. This journey beckons to me, and I take my deep thinking excursions to thus continue to add and subtract considerations for using and optimizing the phenomenon of will. I determined that one has to think deeply and for a long time to sufficiently plumb the depths of the phenomenon of will. Not wanting to stop at understanding the phenomenological aspects of will, I grew even more determined to take this deep dive to know the intricacies of will. Such knowledge is essential for using advanced data, information, and knowledge to understand will in sufficient depth to put it into practice. Our aim? To possess and use data, information, and knowledge to gain a condition of superiority over our opponent and use this condition to win in battles of wills. In my view, such a condition of information superiority in hand, we can control the flow of data, information, and knowledge. Such control provides the capability to attack our adversary's coevolution processor. Success in attacking his flow of data into his assessment processes can help us to successfully impose our will on our adversary. As you see in the book and throughout this briefing, comprehending will requires hard mental work. Accordingly, we must challenge our minds and frequently travel to our high ground of thought and into the depths of our inner sanctum to contemplate what each consideration means. Will is so difficult that as one examines its parts, such as considerations, they find the pressing requirement to dive deeper into the ocean of will. We must do this to learn from will's depths how to employ the considerations under study in mental and physical combat. This kind of conflict will occur in particular contexts, working against specific adversaries. One has to know what they intend to do to us to successfully impose their will relative to what we want to do to them to impose our will. I'm sure you see and agree that this is an interesting dynamic. Of course, you agree with the notion of duality and riding the wild pendulum to assist in causing the dynamic to enable your side to win. With improved understanding of these considerations, we realize how meanings and truths prove to be chameleon-like. I need to explain this proposition further. Changing truths come forth and hit our consciousness from changing adversaries, chaos and operational contexts, nonlinear incidents, and combatants coping with the episodic randomness and friction. With duality, we know it is our foe who is trying to outthink us in contests of will. He engages in mental combat and is capable in this kind of fighting. He views the information age as being a perfect setting to attain information superiority. He desires dominance in all aspects of the information domain. As such, he aims to control the moral and physical aspects of conflict. Ultimately, our adversary always wants to outthink his opponent in the imposition and denial of actions involved with clashes of will. These considerations of will involve the thinking that people must perform to broaden and deepen their thinking. The goal is, of course, to thus optimize the use of knowledge as a weapon system in its own right. Such intellectual competence comes from study and contemplation of these considerations of will. Our goal is, of course, to triumph in contests of will and quickly and soundly thrash the adversary's will into submission and impose our will in any contests. I originally designed over 40 considerations of will, but the list was unwieldy and I had some duplication. So I shortened it to what I construed to be the most important considerations. Even with this pairing, however, you must know that typically people won't have time to consider all 18 considerations. Instead, you always need to prune the tree of considerations and select the right fruit, as it were, appropriate to the mission, situation, context, and adversary. Gaining sufficiency in our thinking to be competent in each consideration is challenging. Then, gaining sufficient knowledge about each of these considerations to turn them into action is even more difficult. Our goal is to leverage each consideration to design actions and to co-evolve faster and more efficiently and effectively than the adversary. More or fewer considerations should be appropriate depending upon the adversary, context, your aim, goals, objectives, and so forth. It follows that thought warriors need flexible minds to work with and apply their chosen selection of considerations for working with will. You discover that the list of consideration demands comprehension. Unfortunately, they flux and change owing to the contextual chaos and the actions of our adversary and other opponents in the fray, such as neutrals. Thus, know well that these 18 considerations serve as guides and stimulus to our thinking. They are not dogma. Also, in my experience, people rarely perform the mental work to contemplate these considerations. The reason is that each proved difficult to think about from all perspectives relative to the culture, which provides the wallpaper of the context in which our contest of wills is occurring. Reasons for careful and limited selection of considerations should include time and the intellectual difficulty of thoroughly understanding the consideration. Also, one could find it difficult to employ acquired knowledge when coping with the dynamic nature of a co-evolving adversary and the influence of turbulence in a nonlinear context. Thus, the validity of gained knowledge has a short half-life. Our minds have to be nimble and agile to move on and adapt. Or perhaps the context might not prove sufficient conditions for some consideration to be relevant. But rest assured, the potential for change and movement toward goals and objectives lurks and lives in the heart and mind of your opponent who is waiting for the right moment to strike and impose his will on you. Thus, you realize that the considerations you select must always relate to potential probabilities coming and going and becoming relevant to an adaptive adversary in fluid context. Remember from our earlier discussion that the adversary at CAS has to act, assess, evaluate assessment data, learn, and adapt even in the always changing operational context. And perhaps the adversary's nature doesn't match with all of the considerations. It follows that your mind must move from the present to what is most likely in future courses of action based on your wargaming. This necessity clarifies how you need to co-evolve and to be in a position of superiority as your adversary adapts. You can discover such anticipatory work as you perform one of the book's biggest ideas. That is, to learn how to wargame the adversary's wargaming and comprehend what his considerations of will are and how they appear. I want you to be there waiting to pounce once he comes into your anticipatory trap. With all of these thoughts swirling in your mind, my advice is to carefully choose the considerations to work with and to draw a cut line between selected and not selected. For those considerations below the cut line, you find that old bogeyman risk. Thus, ensure people you work with know that you have delineated risks. They also need to know how you intend to mitigate negative outcomes of each risk if things go badly. In conflicts of will, there will always exist the high potential for truth to change. Thus, involved people have to anticipate change, prepare for its induced vagaries, and be nimble of thought and organization. This finding requires a sentinel of sorts to warn you to periodically revisit your interpretation of the considerations of will. At the same time, you and your red teamers must constantly evaluate the efficacy of your assumptions, influence of logic errors, and your biases. Our goal is, of course, to make the optimal use of incoming data, information, and knowledge. Armed with the knowledge that truth changes implies to active minds a distinct need for anticipation, flexibility, and an understanding of the variables that play in the context. This knowledge also causes us to recognize the connections between that which makes the original truth right and believable, but also the presence of multiple strands connecting the current truth with a form, object, or shape of a new truth coming into being. Choosing such a mental course of action proves vital to deep thinking, sufficient to notice and address changes in existing conditions. We must also learn to recognize either obvious or subtle appearances of new and suddenly demanding considerations of will. Such thinking proves necessary for spotting adversarial attacks against your assessment systems via deception. So let's now talk about these 18 considerations. All appear in the book in a table, and the book explains each. In fact, I devote entire chapters to most of these considerations. Thus, I propose that one must consider the right elements of the table to succeed in planning for and executing impositions of will. Here are the brief definitions of each of the 18 considerations. 1. Life force means impetus force within a human being that ignites and motivates purpose, strength of motive, capabilities, passion, sacrifice, and so on. Life force is a fundamental dynamism within one's being that compels a person to take what another person possesses. 2. Purpose is the reason, grounds for, cause for which something is done or created, or why something exists. 3. Capability is the means, ability, and potential to perform or achieve designed actions or outcomes through a set of observed and measured acts, activities, and influences. 4. Strength of motive needs to be divided. Strength is the status of being strong, such as taking a stance against unfavorable odds or potential cost or loss. Motive is the force or energy or other provocative phenomena that causes a people to act in a certain way, do a certain thing, endure deprivations, or operate, act, and behave, or perform. It involves not only its content or purpose, but also the action and outcomes that cause. Motive is sublimated to life force and purpose, but it infuses energy to all of the other elements in my model of will. 5. Passion is a strong craving whose presence and influence interferes with rational thought. It often appears as emotion, which can imprison rational thought. With passion, one's rationale and deep thinking capabilities decay. This means that the adversary, context, and derivative considerations become victims of highly influential emotion of passion. Naturally, one has to take into account the presence of passion not only with respect to the adversary, but with respect to one's own forces. As another perspective for your consideration, know the difficulty in wargaming passion extends to the other side as they try to estimate the passion your force has. To understand it, we have to think and feel the emotion our adversary experiences, whether strong, weak, or dormant. Passion does matter, and you must take it seriously. Number 6, perseverance is the indomitable continuation, lasting power, resolute finishing of an action, or dogged continued defense against another person's imposition of their will. 7, determination involves a firmness of one's fixation on resolve, purpose, resistance, and imposition actions. People can comprehend the difference between determination and its twin, perseverance, by envisioning determination as a fuel that propels perseverance. This fuel flows throughout the 14-step will model to potentially empower decision makers' wills. 8, advantage and disadvantage. Advantage, a situation of being in a preferable position over another competitor. Disadvantage is a state or an instance of being in an unfavorable circumstance or condition. 9, sacrifice means a readiness to endure loss, even with physical and emotional pain, for the sake of accomplishing a goal, objective, successfully executing a strategy, or hating, retributing, and of course, leaders' exhortations. 10, affecting complex adaptive systems or CAS adaptation cycles. The nub of this consideration revolves around the notion of coevolution. Reinforcing what we heard about in an earlier section, this word means the evolution of 2 or more species or organisms, natural or man-made, that interact closely with one another, with each acting, assessing, and adapting to changes in the others. All complex adaptive systems involve people and their organizations. I take some license to borrow the term complex adaptive system, or better known as CAS, from physics and other scientific use. As such, I use it to describe human beings, their organizations, and their activities. Thus, all CAS must co-evolve, meaning they must approximate the following process: act, assess, design assessment observables, collect assessment data, turn data into information and knowledge, evaluate, learn, and adapt. All CAS must strive to adapt faster and better than their adversary or face neutralization or death. Thus, I say it is only natural for competing organisms to attack their opponents' co-evolutionary processes, people, and machinery. I submit it is logical to assume that competing organisms must anticipate and thwart such attacks on them or their co-evolutionary apparatuses while simultaneously planning to attack or confuse their opponents' co-evolutionary and adaptation maneuverings. The way of thinking among warring castes must be the way of aggression, as even when aggressively searching for opportunities and advantages, they are aggressively thinking about their own vulnerabilities. Therefore, a must-duty is to characterize the organism's intelligence collection and their analysis and counterintelligence apparatuses, because each gathers and interprets assessment data, which ultimately points to their future adaptation. An adversary's adaptation process is vulnerable to exploitation, and it must be vigorously attacked, killed, or neutralized. And be forewarned, once again, your adaptation process is subject to being attacked too. 11. That which truly matters involves using our reasoning powers and higher level thinking skills, such as analysis, synthesis, and holism. People use these thinking methods to discern the nub or central idea of value. Also, we have to think about capability and strength of motive. With deep thinking, knowledge blooms from the manipulation of data into information and the transformation of information into knowledge. Winners in contests of wills always seek ways to twist this knowledge sufficiently to transform and fit it to gain power. Knowing that which truly matters is a powerful capability because it also gives us a peek behind the curtain masking the inner thoughts of people with whom we compete. This knowledge and notion of that which truly matters is influential in that it connects with other parts of the book, such as value of the objective. Recognizing that which truly matters must appear in our repertoire of moral and physical domain weapons to win in a contest of wills. However, remember the word duality. Here it means that the adversary will be trying to think as you think and protect that which truly matters from your efforts to exploit. Thus, know your adversary always considers and then attacks what he thinks you think that which truly matter means to mean. 12. Marvelous Trinity, Incentive, and Inducement. Trinity, as I paraphrase from Clausewitz's tome on war, is composed of primordial violence, hatred, and enmity. It has a natural blind force. It involves the play of chance and probability, where creative spirit is free to roam. The Trinity and its elements are instruments of policy, which makes it subject to reason. The first of these three elements concerns the people, the second the commander and his army, the third the government. Clausewitz on War, page 89. I advise you to know that your opponent intends to protect his trinity and to attack yours. Incentives prove important in considerations of will. An incentive incites or tends to incite to action as a reward offered for increased productivity. It also means an action, reward, or promise that could motivate or encourage desired action in an opponent. Know that an incentive is benign because there is no punishment intimated if the incentive is rejected or if it fails to alter behavior. An inducement is similar to incentive, but an important difference exists. Yes, an inducement is an offer that promises or encourages one side to accept the terms of the other side's desired outcome, but an inducement is more threatening than incentive. It implies punishment if the receiving side tries to manipulate conditions of the agreement for their self-interest. Thus, an inducement is not benign and is actively dangerous because punishment is implied for rejection or for the failure to change a behavior. 13. Value of objectives. Value means a moral principle or belief. One or more values means an acceptance and standardizing behavior of a person or a social group. Values dictate the worth or things, principles, goals to accomplish, or power that people seek to control. A value derives from the culture and one's perspective. Know that organizations and countries have values. The culture houses, explains, and enforces rules relative to values. Thus, it is self-evident that values live in cultures in which operational contexts and battles of will exist. Values prove sufficient and significant, sometimes prized, in a variety of ways by all sides in a competitive situation. An objective is a deliberate action that consumes mental and physical energy. This energy helps to feed the appetite of the elements comprising will and its 14 key elements. The book discusses the value of objectives in depth. Suffice it to say, there is a value to objective ratio one can use to help them think. As one example, I show in the book a way to divide the value to objective ratio into quarters. The first 25% involves the quality of thinking in this sequence: vision, desire, resolve, will, purpose, capability, strength of motive, advantage, disadvantage, perseverance, determination, passion, sacrifice, action, assess, collect assessment data, evaluate, learn, and adapt. This is a sequence of one's imposition of his will on other people, organizations, nations, and the like. It has to be effective to enable the act of imposing one's will to be successful. The second 25% involves a must consideration of duality. This judgment leads to the back and forth of wargaming the adversary's wargaming, identifying how he thinks and how he thinks you think, and so on. The third 25% involves identifying his highly considered objectives. I counsel you to take these prized objectives away or alter their state of appearance and capability. My belief is that such a focused attempt at the heart of his most prized and valuable objectives will cause him angst and deprivation. Such a well-aimed stroke also influences the physical well-being of the recipients of your actions, as well as cognitive dissonance, causing divergence in their thinking, acting, assessing, and adapting. The fourth 25% involves protecting our objectives and their value via anticipation, wargaming our adversary's wargaming, and influencing his intelligence system. This tack attacks or manipulates one's adversary's intelligence feeds, supporting his coevolutionary needs. Out of necessity, he must continuously gather data to feed his decide, act, assess, evaluate, learn, and adapt faster and better than his adversary's cycles. His coevolutionary cycles are vulnerable to manipulation and neutralization. 14. Constraint is a restraint or limitation on action or behavior. The constraint can appear due to morals, values, lack of resources, limited capabilities, limited time, contextual turbulence, legal restraints, or cultural inhibitions. A constraint can impede the efforts or desires of people attempting to impose their will on another person, or while trying to block an adversary as he attempts to impose his will on you. 15. Pressure points, decisive points, and centers of gravity. A pressure point is a sensitive critical point, weakness, or dispute against which pressure of many persuasions is directed. A decisive point is a geographical place, specific key event, critical factor, or function that, which acted on, allows leaders to gain a marked advantage over an adversary or contribute materially to achieving success. This comes from U.S. Joint Pub Staff Publication 1-02. Centers of gravity, the hub of all power and the movement on which everything depends. That is the point all our energies should be directed. This comes from Clausewitz, pages 595 through 596 in On War. Please note that as you think deeply, you see these three notions, sometimes realities, as they entangle. The entangling amalgamation of these three concepts, pressure points, decisive points, and centers of gravity, into a whole comprised of aggregates and aggregations contribute to discerning that which truly matters and the values of objectives. 16. As we think about kinds of will, we must include a substantial variety. The variety includes adversary's will, friendly will, populist's will, willpower, not our focus in this book, imposition of will, blocking others' impositions of their will, governed people and their collective wills, individual will, groups of people and their combined will, leaders' will, governing people and their will, organization will, and so on. Keeping this extensive variety of wills in mind, the important ideas to remember involving these following views include: settle on the will or wills that you must compete with to win. Define the target that you intend to impose your will upon. Identify the goals and objectives you seek and plan to sever their linkage with the wills you target for action. Consider the struggle of will from your adversary's perspective. Anticipate your target's strength of motive, capabilities, and other pertinent elements of the 14-element thought model the book presents. Along with imposition comes its antipode. That is, one always has to consider how your adversary will try to impose his will on you. Always consider your adversary's self-interest, true purpose, strength of motive, capabilities, perseverance, determination, sacrifice, passion, advantages, disadvantages, and so on. As a last aspect of this consideration, I want you to think about the astonishing phenomenon of unintended consequences and the birth of new kinds of will. Think about the appearance of congealing combinations that come forth first as a single aggregate, but soon transform into an aggregation. It too transforms and becomes much stronger and much more likely to have the capabilities to successfully impose the aggregation of aggregates, will on others. Or, naturally, this aggregation could be a constraint to your efforts. 17. Fear of alternatives. Let's break the phrase apart. Fear means a disturbing or threatening emotion arising from a premonition of lurking danger, trepidation of impending experience, or a foreboding state of mind coming from one's mental and emotional status. Alternative means the presence of certain flexibility, the appearance of varied options, a vision of different method or path, or the availability of a selection from which to choose. Alternative proves to be a close relative to potentiality, which I define as possibilities unbound by constraints. 18. A pressure is the continuous physical or emotional weight a decision maker, or anyone for that matter, feels, intuits, senses, or thinks about as they make a decision. The pressure comes from dealing with turbulence, nonlinearity, fear of failure, risk, ego, self-interest, and the unknown coming from not knowing the adversary's heart and mind, and the changes that come once the contextual pool of quiet water becomes agitated with stimulation and intrusion. Example of pressures of interest to us could include self-pressure, ego, and self-esteem, physical, adversarial, organizational, political, historical, cultural, familial, hatred, revenge, and so on. We have to know our own potential pressures in which the adversary could attack purposely, creating pressure on the friendly leadership hierarchy with the goal of seeking advantages or attacking valuable objectives or causing perturbation in that which truly matters to us. And the antipode once again, that is, know the adversary's vulnerability to pressure and vigorously attack it. Now we are off to a different aspect of this journey. That is, we are going to think about the adversary's mind's eye and how the thinking adversary thinks and how one attacks the adversary's plan at their inception. Mission, say a task or a social outing, the single cast in its individual context conjoins with other casts and their individual context. Thus they form an aggregate, which is a microcontext. If two or more aggregates conjoin, an aggregation of casts and their context are enclosed in a larger operational context. Operational because said people have a purpose for congregating and performing some action or activity that requires an operation of some kind. This is a macro-small context. When two macro-small contexts conjoin, one finds a macro-large context. We know that a larger context always exists around smaller bubbles, as individuals, aggregates, or aggregations as I've described. They knowingly connect with the micro and macro context in which they exist and that exists around them. Let's quickly review, as I know this must be difficult to grasp. In a general context, one finds, first, individual context. I consider individual context as membranes with an outer texture of context that surround and influence organisms existing within the operational context. Second, microcontext is larger than the individual context and contains at least two individual contexts. Third, macro-small context is, of course, larger than the microcontext and contains two or more microcontexts. Fourth, macro-large context is larger than the macro-small context and contains at least two or more macro-small contexts. Of note, these four contexts contain the actors and their organizations who struggle for triumph of their wills on opposing actors and their organizations. The actors, of course, are castes. An operational context contains countless striving and counter-striving castes and caste-populated organizations. Remember, though, in any conflict, context is neutral. This means the context presents opportunity, but it also secretes misfortune. To find or create advantage, one must imagine how their competitor perceives, thinks, plans, decides, acts, assesses, prepares observables, collects, turns the data into information, synthesizes information into knowledge, evaluates, learns, and adapts. One must know how their adversary ruminates about his personal context and his larger context. They also have to consider how he senses his adversary's context from this person or organization's view. Sometimes one must be aggressive and disturb the universe with the express purpose of using the subsequent turbulence, change, and chaos to create and seize advantages from the operational context itself. Advantages that castes seek can involve initiative, tempo, momentum, knowledge, decision, position, and freedom of movement. All sides in competition struggle to find or create advantages in an operational context. Competing castes struggle to achieve advantage for themselves. At the same time, they attack or manipulate their adversaries with the intention of causing disadvantages to appear and influence. The struggle for contextual advantage is an important aspect of all struggles over ascendancy of will. Let's work with another angle of context. That is, variables live in the operational context. Variables can appear and cause some perturbation, but they often remain dormant. Then, with the right combinations of other variables or changes coming with events or actions in the context, they can become powerful yet unpredictable. Certainty can never be known owing to the change and turbulence of chaos, which is characteristic of nonlinearity. When variables become sensitive, they influence and cause change. They cause perturbation and inject either fortune or misfortune into one side or the other, or to all participants. The presence and influence of sensitive variables preside and prove to be always at play in fights over will, and know well they influence outcomes. Opportunities to seize advantage can appear but prove fleeting. Thus, one must be intellectually agile and willing to act quickly, regardless of risk, to grasp a fleeting opportunity and use it for advantage in struggles of will. I want you to consider and remember a few points that should have a lot of meaning in your minds by now. That is to say, 1. View context as a series of ever-increasing or ever-decreasing sizes. The context unfolds into larger bubbles or enfolds smaller bubbles of context. 2. In the field of conflict and competition, a large macro context houses any conflict, competitive event, or bartering activity. 3. A macro context can accept smaller mobile contexts that might be passing through, staying, passing over, or becoming stationary instead of being mobile. 4. Always wargame your actions relative to the context. Additionally, wargame your adversary's wargaming about the operational context and how it presents advantages and disadvantages to this opponent. 5. As an addendum, I ask you to answer a few rhetorical questions. A. What constitutes the main points about an operational context housing people in conflict that you should consider in your thinking and decision making? B. What are my advantages and disadvantages coming from the context? C. What are my adversary's advantages and disadvantages coming from the context? D. How does the adversary think I think about my advantages and disadvantages coming from the context? E. How does the adversary think I think he thinks about advantages and disadvantages the context presents to each side in a conflict? F. What does an adversary consider as he mulls over how his enemy decision maker thinks relative to finding and exploiting advantages and disadvantages in the operational context? G. What characteristics of nonlinearity could be at play, and how must I prepare for them to appear and to wreak havoc? H. Am I prepared for contextual data inputs that could be welcome or unwelcomed? I. Am I viewing the operational context as comprised of 4 kinds of context with castes as occupants that this discussion presents? I close this discussion with the following thoughts. In my world, nothing is easy. Our work with aggregations and context is one of the most difficult concepts in the book, but we cannot flinch owing to abstraction or difficulty. We shall persevere. It takes synthesis and holism to be proficient in this thinking. Chapter 4 in The Power of Will provides much deeper thinking about the subject of operational context. Mine provides you with the preparatory remarks to help you understand what you're going to read in the script correlated with the visuals. My script highlights the main ideas in the book, and I provide you some interpretation and a small degree of explanation for each visual via the explanatory script. Note that the script is peculiar. It is in bigger font to help me see the words. Also, I double-spaced and indented more at select places in the script. You can't review the slides in slideshow, so just keep them in normal view, please. When you see the slide, there will be a small symbol of a speaker in the lower right-hand corner. Mouse over it and then click on the arrow and it will play. It will stop when the talking finishes. Then just move to the next slide and repeat. I designed all measures except for the restriction to keep the slide view as normal to help me see well enough to read coherently. As another interesting tidbit, the script is more than it appears to be and is sufficient for people to read as they review the visuals, listen to the verbiage, take notes, and develop their questions and answers. Questions and answers should be occurring during any presentation of my book. In my view, all intent listeners develop and use their notes and questions and answers as lines of further inquiry and pursuit of knowledge. This session is no exception. I believe it would be best if people could possess and read the script and stay with the person describing the visuals. And, of course, the person responsible for the session, presenting the visuals, and reading the script must read and understand my book. Note, too, that the script numbers correlate with the slides. There are 32 substantive visuals, so there are 32 parts of the text, and readers can easily connect slide numbers with the beginning of each page of the text. This part is easy as the text title, text header, and visual all line up with one another. People can work through the entire session most effectively by reading the script as they move slide by slide, matching script pages and sections with respective visuals. I think that the readers and listeners will understand the visuals and script, and they will be motivated to read the book. But be advised, any presenter needs to rehearse. And once again, they must read and master the book as they will be responding to the questions of students looking for answers. I judge the quality of this presentation to be 90 to 95%. I have never done anything like this, so I admit to a few mistakes in grammar and stumble and mumble in a few places as I read the script. Therefore, I do apologize for any mistakes that I made. The script appears lengthy, and I acknowledge its length. While the script is lengthy, it is but a mere sniff of my book. Please read the book and take the time and expend the mental energy to think deeply and critically about what you read.